Welcome to Eternal Dread, where fear never sleeps. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because terror has no limits. If you're brave enough, share and comment, but beware, something might be watching you too. Now, turn off the lights and let the dread begin. My phone began buzzing. The incoming video call was from Frankie's burner phone. My heart was palpitating rapidly, and a painful pit swelled up in my belly. The video feed lit up with a sinister ambience as I answered, revealing a chilling scene. The screen was filled with hooded figures in an otherwise empty-looking room. In middle of said room, a figure was on its knees, with their hands tied behind their back. The room was dimly lit and dank. The surroundings appeared to be the basement of a warehouse or factory. Large water pipes scaled the walls from the ceiling to the floor. There was a low but constant hum of what I assumed to be machinery of some sort. One of the masked figures stepped forward, his gloved hands reaching to slowly remove the shroud of the kneeling person and revealed a terrified face. With a sudden and heart-wrenching gesture, Frankie's identity was revealed, and I could see the fear etched into his eyes. Just then, Mr. Voss, the cold and ruthless figure, snatched Frankie's phone and glared back at me with contempt. He wasted no time taunting me, his voice laced with sadistic pleasure. "We caught your rat where he doesn't belong. How many of us have you executed? Dozens? More? It's my turn, and I'm going to show you exactly what it feels like to lose your best friend." Frankie's vulnerability mirrored that of the rusting pipes and the crumbling shambles of the room around him. Mr. Voss focused the phone back on Frankie, before ordering one of his masked henchmen to deliver a brutal punch to Frankie's face. His cruel laugh then filled the room, chilling me to the core. Through the laughing, "Damn, that looked like it hurt," Malachi finished. Mr. Voss then asked the ominous question, if Frankie had any last words? With unyielding determination, Frankie raised his chin in defiance and locked eyes with me. Even through the phone's screen, I could feel his unwavering resolve. His voice echoed through the sparse room and carried a message of strength. "Phoenix, keep the mission alive. He who fears death is in denial," he proclaimed. "How noble, stupid, but noble," Malachi replied, before ordering his masked henchman to slowly withdraw something from just out of the camera's frame. It was revealed to be a sawed-off shotgun. I felt helpless and panic surged through me, but I couldn't look away. In an agonizingly slow moment, the shotgun was aimed directly at Frankie's head. I didn't even get a chance to bargain with them, and before I could close my eyes, there was a deafening blast that erupted from the screen. The masked guy squeezed the trigger, and Frankie's head exploded like a watermelon. The gory sounds of the remnants that used to be Frankie's skull violently splattered to the ground. It was a tidal wave of blood, bone, and brain matter that scattered across the dirty concrete floor. Malachi, his sinister face filled with malevolence, turned the phone back to himself. A cruel smile played on his lips as he issued a final warning. "This is just a small taste of what we will do to you, and everyone you love, if you don't back off and stay out of our business. You have no idea what you're fucking with." With a sinister chuckle, Malachi ended the call, leaving me with the haunting aftermath of Frankie's gruesome demise. The lifeless phone slipped from my fingertips and dropped to the ground at my feet. My eyes instantly welled up and tears cascaded down my cheeks. I couldn't get that image out of my head, and how my oldest, greatest friend was now gone in the blink of an eye. I had to break it to Jennifer. Retelling what happened made me lose it all over again. Through my sniffling and tears, I went over the gruesome moment with as little details as possible. I had to protect her good memories of Frankie. I then broke the news to Veronica, and she was the only one who kept a brave face. She's always been so strong, and she cared for me while I grieved. As if watching everything unfold wasn't horrifying enough, a week later I received an encrypted video file of Malachi directing his henchmen to dispose of Frankie's body. The mountain of a man lifted Frankie's body with relative ease and pushed it forcefully into a wood chipper. The scene surrounding them was a densely thick forest. The serene chirping of birds quickly became drowned out when Malachi flipped the switch and the machine whirred to life. The bloody remains spurted out the other side and into one of those lawn clipping collection bags. Mr. Voss next turned the wood chipper off, and its roar immediately died. The giant brute then grabbed up the lawn bag and carried it over to an industrial-sized drum. The image then focused down into the barrel, revealing a steaming, cloudy liquid. The camera panned down a little lower to reveal the contents of the barrel: hydrofluoric acid. The unnamed bodyguard then poured the squelching pile of gore into the barrel. The shredded flesh sizzled and hissed as it hit the acid. Within seconds, every proof of Frankie's existence was completely dissolved into the caustic liquid. Malachi stared directly into the camera's lens and smirked. "Just taking out the trash," he finished with a wink. I grew up here, secluded on the top of a hill, no neighbors as far as the eye can see. On starless nights, I vividly remember this farmhouse casting a dim light across the surrounding woodland like the lone candle flickering atop a first birthday cake. Its 2 stories had more rooms than the 3 of us, my parents and I, knew what to do with. The excessive space was the only extravagance, though. Otherwise, the house wasn't much more than a porch, a gabled roof, and a musty, unfurnished cellar with a bunch of empty rooms sandwiched in between. The property has been in my deadbeat of a father's family for generations. When he stepped out on us, ownership passed on to my mother. She died in her sleep 3 months ago, so now it's mine. All of which is to say, I'd stepped over that space in the cellar hundreds of times over the course of my life, but I'd never seen that small wooden hatch until this week. Or, maybe more accurately, I'd never perceived it until this week. When I pulled the rope to open the hatch, finally at my wit's end with the whole of it, the constant whistling, the screeching violin, the ungodly angel, I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. It took me a while to wrap my mind around the mechanics. Once it clicked, though, the magnitude of the impossible contradiction lit my spine on fire. Through the hatch, I saw the ceiling of an attic I didn't recognize. Although it was the middle of the night where I was, it was daytime in the room beneath me. I could tell by the pure blue sky and the sunlight streaming from the open window in one of its corners. I'm getting slightly ahead of myself, though. Life is such a maddeningly complex phenomenon, and yet, your brain will try to convince you it's all relatively straightforward. What you see in front of you is what's there, full stop. No room for nuance, no space for intricacy. It is what it is. My dad, the self-proclaimed clairvoyant, taught me otherwise. He'd say things like, reality is a painting that spreads on forever, in every direction. Perception is the frame. Everyone and everything is born with a different frame. Some are bigger, some are smaller. Your experience in this life is only what lives in that frame, but don't let that mislead you. It's a grain of sand, not the whole beach. As much as I despise the man, I have to admit that he could dispense some wisdom when the mood suited him. Science has only progressed to prove him correct as well. Take the mantis shrimp, for example. Unassuming little crustaceans that, somehow, can perceive 12 separate wavelengths of color, staggering in comparison to our measly 3, red, green, and blue. Their frame of perception captures a piece of reality distinct from our own, illustrating that just because we can't see those 9 additional colors, doesn't mean they aren't there. Maybe I wouldn't have spent my 20s homeless on the streets of Chicago if he stayed around long enough to impart his entire sagely portfolio, rather than just a few breadcrumbs here and there. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that he'd say all this 1 minute, acting like a paragon of philosophical thought, and then loudly complain that he was being stalked by biblically accurate angels the next. I have multiple memories of him telling my mother through urgent whispers that they were watching his every move. Balls of eyes like a pile of burning coals lurking in all the empty spaces of our home, staring at him. The man was unhinged. When my mother wasn't around, he'd ask me if I could see them as well. Told me that most of the men in our bloodline can massage the veil, whatever the fuck that means. He'd go on to explain that, if I should happen to peer in between the layers of reality, I shouldn't be afraid, but I should be careful. Standing above me, his pupils wide and black like falling meteors in the night sky, he'd warn me of the so-called dangers. The more you look, the more you'll see. The more things that you can see, the more things that can see you back. I think I was 7 when he first said that. You want to know how to instill crippling anxiety in a child? Fear so debilitating that it manifests as wild, unchecked alcoholism once it's given the opportunity? This is a great recipe. Until the hatch in the cellar, never saw a goddamn thing that shouldn't logically be there, despite my deeply ingrained fears. Heard some things, though. Somber, wordless lullabies from somewhere deep inside a broom closet. The pitch of the voice wavering abruptly between a little too high and a little too low. The notes of a pipe organ falling gently from my bedroom ceiling like raindrops. Lyrics sung to me by a child I couldn't see in a language I didn't understand. Naturally, I took my dad's advice, pretended like I couldn't hear the phantom noises. For the most part, he turned out to be right. That tactic kept a lid on things. Moving back into my childhood home was a mistake, but it was a steady roof over my head for the first time in years, and my mom needed the help. For the 6 months that I was taking care of her, the house was quiet. As soon as she passed, though, the ethereal clamor returned at a peak intensity. I had no more distractions, I guess. The night after the funeral, I was sitting on the porch, absorbed in a moment of bitter tranquility as I listened to the quiet chatter coming from the forest. I sipped warm, decaffeinated coffee, doing my damnedest to avoid thinking about how much more comforting a tumbler of whiskey would be. The sound of a melody interrupted that internal conflict, cutting through the tuneless humming of insects. The noise was shrill, oddly familiar, and it wasn't coming from the wilderness. It was someone whistling, and they were behind me, projecting the melody from somewhere within the house. I sprang from my rocking chair to face the disembodied sound drifting through the open door. The act of me jumping up made a lot of noise, the feet of the chair creaking, the thump of my boots slamming against the floorboards. But the whistling didn't react. It didn't slow or stop. The melody kept on, eerily unfazed by the abrupt calamity. As I stood in front of the doorway, terror galloped through me, shaking my body like the thrums of an earthquake. Eventually, adrenaline converted fear into anger, and anger always comes packaged with a bit dumb courage. I grabbed a baseball bat from my mom's old truck and proceeded to do laps through the hallways of my childhood home with a teetering look of confidence. As I stomped from room to room, the melody ringing in my ears, salty tears unexpectedly welled up under my eyes. The airy refrain was just so familiar, but I still couldn't discern why it was familiar. Tracking the sound to its origin put me in front of the hatch for the first time. It wasn't more than a few steps from the bottom of the stairs. I rounded the corner, pulled the metal drawstring that turned on the cellar's dusty light bulb, and there it was. Positioned in the middle of the basement, an oaken trapdoor with a frayed rope attached, emitting the muffled whistling like it was a buried jukebox. In the blink of an eye, I felt my bravery evaporate, released in tandem with the copious sweat that was now dripping from every inch of my body. My mom needed supplemental oxygen in the last few months of her life, and this is where we kept the tanks, right over the space that the hatch now occupied. It had been nothing but dirt the day before. I stared at the closed passageway from the safety of the cellar landing, but I did not dare approach. Not that night, at least. Instead, I let the baseball bat fall limply from my hand, turned around, and walked back up the stairs. Numb to the point of indifference, I continued another flight of stairs up to my bedroom, and I immediately crumbled onto my mattress. 5 days ago, utter exhaustion allowed rest to come easily. Since then, however, sleep has evaded me completely. The whistling wasn't some bizarre manifestation of grief that would vanish once I woke up, like I had hoped that first night. When my eyes fluttered open, it was still there, faint but consistent like the ticking of a grandfather clock. My boss at the nearby grocery store sounded worried when I called him, requesting to be placed back on the schedule for the week. Originally, I had taken bereavement leave through the end of the month. After the whistling started, though, I would have done anything to occupy myself outside the house. With $50 in my savings account, I had little options, and I was desperate not to find myself slapping those $50 against the surface of a bar top. Eventually, he relented. At first, time away from the incessant whistling helped. 3 days in, though, the melody turned out to be quite the earworm. It rang in my head like church bells, reverberating endlessly against acoustic bone, but never actually dissipating, no matter how much time I spent away from it. Yesterday, I was standing over the stovetop in my kitchen, forcing undercooked scrambled eggs down my throat as quickly as its muscles would allow me, so I could leave for work. Retching from the revolting texture, I placed the ceramic plate down on the tile countertop with more power than I intended. As a result, a loud clatter exploded through the room. Briefly, I couldn't hear the whistling over the sound. When the plate stilled, the air had finally stilled too. Pure, unabated silence filled my ears. A tremendous wave of relief flooded through my chest. From where I stood, the cellar door was directly behind me. Before I could really savor the relief, that door creaked open, the splintered wood present on the bottom dragging harshly against its frame. Reflexively, I spun around. The door was newly ajar, but nothing and no one was there. Heart thumping and wide-eyed, I waited in the silence, trying to seduce thick air into my lungs as I watched for whatever had opened the door to finally appear. I stared at the space, breathless, and yet still nothing came. Until I blinked, that is, and then it was just there. When my eyelids opened, it had materialized in the entryway, motionless and grotesque beyond comprehension. A wheel of charcoal flesh, approximately 6 feet tall and 2 feet wide, held up by 3 hands protruding from its base. The wheel itself was littered with eyes, thousands of frost-white, sickly-looking orbs of differing sizes with no irises or pupils. Some blinked rapidly, inhumanly quick like the shutter of a camera lens. Others stayed open, their focus placed solely on me with indecipherable intent. The hands grew out of a central stump, sprouting haphazardly from the wheel with no sense of design or forethought. They were like rampaging tumors, expanding aimlessly while also fighting for space and control. The largest was in the back, supporting the fleshy construct with a half-crescent of muscular fingers, at least 30 in total, if not more. 2 smaller, weaker hands jutted out the front. They were nearly twins, but the appendages had slight differences in their knuckle placement and their overall brawn. Unable to remain unblinking indefinitely, my eyes eventually closed. I instantly forced them back open, expecting that the wheel would have moved to pounce in the time I wasn't watching it. Instead, it had vanished. Or worse, it was still there, staring at me from 1,000 distinct vantages, but I simply wasn't perceiving it anymore. I tried to convince myself that I was just losing my mind. Hallucinations from a grief-stricken, maladapted, alcohol-deprived brain. The angel's departure left something behind, however, which confirmed to me its ungodly existence. When I stepped towards the cellar door, I noticed a trail of black ash that led down the stairs and across the dirt floor. Of course, I would later find that the trail ended right at the edge of the hatch. I bent over and rubbed some of it between my fingers. The ash was thin like soot, but it was inexplicably cold, to the point where it felt like I was developing frostbite. As I rinsed the dust off in the sink, my panic quickly rising from the biting pain, the whistling abruptly resumed, now accompanied by the harsh screeches of what sounded like a violin. Over the next day, sometimes the violin mirrored the melody, and sometimes it played the melody with a slight delay, lagging chaotically behind the whistle's reliable tempo. No matter what it did, the unseen instrument was brutally out of tune. The discord was like a cheese grater sliding against my brain, shredding flecks of my sanity off with every drag. I would wager I slept for no longer than an hour last night, restlessly watching for the return of the black wheel. As far as I could tell, though, it never came. When dawn spilled through my bedroom window, however, I noticed something that turned my blood into sleet. There was a silhouette made of the ash above my bed in the wheel's shape. No idea when it got there or why I was just noticing it then. My eyes followed the ash as it curved along the wall, down onto the floor, under my locked bedroom door, eventually leading all the way back to the hatch. Maybe it crawled up here in the brief moments I was asleep, but I think the more likely explanation is that lingered above my bed while I was still awake, present but imperceptible. Half a day later, I would cautiously push my head through the open hatch, seeing for myself what existence looked like on the other side. I'm not expecting you to understand why I didn't run. All I can say is, over time, the melody beckoned me through the threshold. For hours ago, I anchored myself to the cellar by a rope tied to my waist and the foot of a nearby water heater. Like I said at the top of this post, although night had fallen outside, it was the middle of the day in the attic when I pulled the hatch open. Oddly, the whistling had become fairly quiet, and the discordant violin had disappeared entirely. The notes of the whistling were clearer, but overall, the melody was softer. Driven by a magnetism I couldn't possibly understand at that moment, I lowered my head and my shoulders into the passageway. The experience fucked up my internal equilibrium in ways that I can't find the right words to describe. I was putting my body down, but as my eyes peered over the attic floor, my head felt like it was going up. Fighting through pangs of practically existential nausea, I slowly continued to lower myself in. Collarbone deep, I could view most of the attic. To my surprise, there wasn't anything obviously otherworldly. The room itself was pretty barren, nothing but a desk and a sewing machine pushed against the wall opposite to me with a large window above it. I perked my ears, trying to localize the exact point of origin for the whistling. Before I could find it, however, a child unexpectedly walked by my head from behind me, causing a yelp to leap from my vocal cords. Instinctively, I pulled my body out of the hole. Anxiously kneeling next to the open hatch, I waited to hear some response to my outcry. A scream, a distress call to a nearby parent, something to indicate that I had been heard. Unexpectedly, all was quiet on the other side. There was some faint rustling of drawers, and the whistling continued, but otherwise both worlds were still. Now trembling, I once again lowered my head into the hatch. The child, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, was sitting at the desk, kicking their legs and coloring. She looked normal. Certainly wasn't the black wheel of blinking flesh that had invaded my home the day before. Just find what the fuck is making the whistling, I reminded myself. In the cellar, I moved my knees around the perimeter of the hatch, which slowly spun my head around to the part of the attic I hadn't yet seen. When I turned, there was an old wardrobe and a few pieces of furniture covered by a dusty see-through tarp, but nothing more than that. Suddenly, I heard the squeak of the child pushing her chair out from her desk behind me. There was a pause, and then they called out in a voice 3 octaves too low for their size. Is anyone there?" When I turned back, the child was facing me. They stared at me but through me, as if they sensed my presence but didn't see my physical form. I failed to choke back a scream, but when it escaped my lips, they didn't react to it. Their facial texture was horribly distorted, uneven and bubbling from chin to hairline. Both eyes were on their right side, one on their forehead, and one where their cheekbone should be. I could appreciate nearly the entire curve of the higher eye as it bulged outward, while the other eye was reciprocally sunken, showing only the tip of a pupil peeking out from caving skin. Their mouth carved a diagonal line across the face, severing their visage into 2 equal, triangular spaces. They asked again, slower and somehow even deeper this time around, causing their face to practically bloom into a sea of red, pulsating tissue as their diagonal maw spread wide. "Is anyone t'other?" All of a sudden, the whistling's volume became deafening, like it was being sung into my ear from a mere few inches away. At the same time, it was the clearest I'd heard it up until that point. In a moment of horrific realization, I remembered why I knew that godforsaken collection of notes. It was the lead melody from Etude Op. 2 No. 1 by Alexander Scriabin, my father's favorite piece of music, and it wasn't coming from anywhere around me. It was coming from above me. When I looked up, I saw the black wheel, hanging motionless from the rafters by its 3 hands like a sleeping bat. It was so close that my face nearly made contact with its flesh as I tilted my neck. In an explosion of movement, I wrenched my body out of the attic and slammed the hatch down to close the passageway. Through raspy breaths, I sprinted around the basement, pulling boxes and other items on top of the hatch. In less than a minute, there was a mound of random objects stacked on top of the obscene doorway. Feverishly, I inspected the barrier, but it still didn't feel like enough. Scanning the cellar for additional weight, I saw a particularly hefty trunk all the way on the other end of the room. When I darted over to grab it, I was yanked face first onto the hard dirt, momentum halted by the rope that still connected my torso to the water heater. Moaning on the ground, my abdomen burned from the squeeze and my nose, no doubt broken from the fall, leaked warm blood down the back of my throat. The searing pains caused my mania to slow, and I sluggishly turned over onto my back to untie the rope from my waist. As I did, my eyes scanned the cellar. I couldn't see the black wheel around me, but I could still hear the whistling. It was distant, but it was still there. Not only that, but the notes, although faint, seemed to have a bit more energy to them. Like below the hatch, the wheel was excited, overjoyed even. Moments later, the melody ceased. I was skeptical at first, believing it was just another tiny intermission, but it went silent for hours. The hatch was still there too, and in the silence that followed, I feel like I finally understood the message that the whistling was attempting to deliver to me. "Hey son, I'm down here. I may look a little different, but I'm still your father. Now, are you ready to join me?" Decades ago, it seems that my father slipped through a break in reality and ended up somewhere else. Can't tell if that was a voluntary or involuntarily decision on his end, but I theorize he spent so much time out of his natural position that he began to undergo changes. Became one those angels that only he could see from my childhood. The implication being that those angels were people from other places that somehow became stuck in our piece of existence, I guess. Unfortunately, I'm now able to perceive the hole my father disappeared down all those years ago. The optimistic side of me wants to believe the fracture is bound to my childhood home, so burning it down and having it cave in on itself may actually plug the cosmic leak. The pessimistic side of me, on the other hand, recognizes it probably isn't that simple, and that side has some new evidence to bolster their argument as well. It's just like my dad said, the more you look, the more you'll see. The more things that you can see, the more things that can see you back. As I'm sitting in my mom's truck with a canister of gasoline and a box of matches, typing this all up on my weathered iPhone, I'm hearing things in the woods. In front of me, a deep, unearthly voice is humming a new lullaby from within the dark canopy. Behind me, from the black depths of my childhood home, I've begun to hear the whistling again. Minute by minute, both seem to only be getting closer. Is there any point in burning this place to the ground before I go? Or now that I can fully perceive the melodies and the wheel of blinking flesh that my father has become, is there any point in running at all? Where can you even hide from that sort of thing? I just don't know. But I guess I'll find out. The forest was alive again with the bright dawn, yet the air was thick with an unsettling silence. I lay on the ground, the moss beneath me cold and brittle. My head pounded, each beat a relentless drum in my temples. The cry for help still echoed in my mind, though I couldn't tell if it was mine or someone else's. The world around me was a blur, the towering trees swaying ominously in the morning breeze. As I struggled to sit up, the world spun, forcing me to clutch at the ground for balance. My hands were trembling, the dirt beneath my fingers a stark reminder of the night's events. The forest floor was littered with leaves, some disturbed, others untouched, each one a silent witness to the chaos that had unfolded. My memory was fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting distorted images. I recalled walking through the forest, the moonlight casting long shadows, each step deeper into the woods. Then a sound low, guttural, something primal. My heart raced as I thought of it, the fear fresh and raw. I stood, brushing off the dirt, my movements slow and deliberate. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and something metallic. Blood. My stomach churned at the thought. I looked down at my hands, the memory of warmth on my skin, though they were clean now. The confusion was suffocating, each breath a struggle. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming above. As I stumbled forward, my thoughts drifted to Beatrice, her laughter echoing in my mind, now replaced with the haunting stillness of the forest. The weight of the unspoken truth pressed heavily on my chest, making each breath a laborious task. I took a step forward, the crunch of leaves beneath my foot breaking the silence. The path ahead was unclear, but I knew I had to move. The forest was no longer a place of wonder, but a realm of dread, each step a journey deeper into the unknown. The fear was palpable, a living entity that would not let me go. My heart quickened as I stumbled along, afraid of what I knew what I would see. I paused, hesitant to step forward to see the truth. The familiar landmarks were now strangers in this altered reality. The forest, once a place of magic and discovery, was now a labyrinth of horrors. The cry for help echoed again, this time a call to myself, a reminder of what I had done. Then I woke up. I can still feel the weight of the dream pressing down on me again, the images still sharp in my mind. Every night since it happened I have had that dream. The forest, the fear, the overwhelming sense of dread, it all feels like it did that night. It forces me to remember, and then I remember what happened to her. I shudder involuntarily, and a new despair grips me, and I wake again into the nightmare that is my continued existence. I suppose you could call this a confession, though I'm not entirely sure. The truth about what happened in the forest needs to be told, yet I'm torn about revealing it. Beatrice, my fiancée, she was killed, but not by a wild animal as everyone thought. What took her life was far more terrifying. It all happened just a month ago, during a camping trip, when I stumbled upon that cursed fong, and this nightmare began. The drive along the Olympic Peninsula was beautiful. A tapestry of emerald and amber, with sunlight filtering through the dense canopy above, casting pretty patterns on the winding road. The air was thick with the scent of pine trees and moss, a primordial aroma that filled the car as we rolled down the windows, letting the crisp air mingle with our excitement. Beatrice sat beside me, her hair dancing in the breeze, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. She hummed along to the music, her voice soft and melodic, a sound that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I glanced at her, watching as she leaned her head against the window, her gaze lost in the passing landscape. Her profile was silhouetted against the vibrant greens of the forest, and for a moment, I felt a surge of love and nervousness. The small box in my pocket, containing the ring I had chosen for her, felt heavier with each mile. I had planned this trip meticulously, wanting every moment to be perfect, especially the one when I would ask her to spend the rest of her life with me. We had met a year ago, in a campsite not far from here, our paths crossing in the midst of nature's splendor. She had been setting up her tent with the efficiency of someone who had done it 100 times, while I struggled with mine, my inexperience evident. Her laughter, warm and inviting, had drawn me in, and before I knew it, we were sharing stories and laughter around a campfire. Now here we were, returning to the wilderness that had brought us together, ready to embark on a new chapter. As we turned a bend, the campsite came into view, a small clearing nestled among towering evergreens. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind, their leaves rustling softly. The clearing was carpeted with moss, a soft emerald green that seemed to glow in the fading light of day. Beatrice gasped, her eyes lighting up with delight. "It's perfect," she whispered, her voice filled with delight. We pulled into the campsite, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The absence of a park ranger was immediately noticeable, but I brushed it off, attributing it to the seclusion of the area. We were, after all, in a remote part of the peninsula, far from the main tourist trails. Beatrice, ever the practical one, took charge of setting up the tent while I gathered firewood, our movements efficient and practiced from years of shared adventures. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, a sense of unease began to settle over me. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just hours before, now felt oppressive, the silence between the trees heavy and foreboding. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling lingered, a nagging sense that something was off. Beatrice, ever attuned to my moods, noticed my distraction. "Hey, everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft with concern as she placed a hand on my arm. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bit tired, I guess." She looked at me, her eyes searching, but she didn't press. Instead, she squeezed my hand gently and returned to setting up the tent. I watched her, feeling a pang of guilt for not being honest. But I didn't want to ruin the trip, not yet. I had plans, promises to keep, and a future to build. As the darkness deepened, the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, their calls echoing through the trees. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, making them seem to move and twist in the light. Beatrice sat close to me, her warmth a comforting presence, and I knew I had to tell her soon. But for now, I just held her hand, the ring box pressing against my leg, a reminder of the promise I was about to make. The night wore on, the stars twinkling above, and the forest holding its breath. I knew that this trip was just the beginning, a step into the unknown, where the beauty of nature could quickly turn into something more sinister. But in that moment, with Beatrice by my side, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. I had no idea then of how fragile the peace was. Worse still, that the darkness that lurked within the trees was only the beginning of the nightmare that would ruin our future. We woke up to a new day. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy above, casting a warm glow over the campsite. The air was crisp and invigorating. Beatrice and I packed our backpacks with water, snacks, and the park map, eager to explore the trails that moved through the Olympic Peninsula. The absence of a park ranger still lingered in my mind, but I pushed it aside, determined to enjoy our time together. As we set off on the hike, the trail was everything I had imagined, serene, with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. Beatrice walked beside me, her boots crunching on the gravel path. She was in her element, her eyes lighting up with every new sight, every new sound. I couldn't help but steal glances at her, her hair tied back in a loose braid, her cheeks flushed from the exertion. She was beautiful, and I felt a surge of gratitude for that moment, just being there with her. The trail pushed deeper into the forest, the trees growing taller and closer together. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating intricate patterns on the ground. We walked in comfortable silence, the only sound being our footsteps and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you forget the world beyond the trees. As we reached a bend in the trail, Beatrice stopped, her gaze fixed on something ahead. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a broken trail sign. It hung crookedly from a post, the wood splintered and worn. Below it, a faint trail of blood led into the underbrush. My heart quickened as I followed her gaze. The blood was dark, almost black, and it glistened in the faint light. Beatrice frowned, her brow furrowing with concern. "Do you think it's a deer?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. Something about it felt off, but I didn't want to alarm her, not yet. "Probably," I said, trying to sound calm. "Let's take a look." We followed the blood trail, our steps cautious. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the trees closing in around us. The air felt heavier, thick with an almost palpable tension. Beatrice stayed close, her hand brushing against mine. As we pushed through the underbrush, we stumbled into a small clearing. What we found was nothing short of horrifying. A large deer lay on the ground, its body torn apart with brutal force. The carcass was mutilated, pieces scattered across the clearing. Deep claw marks scored the trees, too large for any local wildlife. Dark blood trails led in multiple directions, as if the deer had been dragged, then torn apart. Beatrice gasped, her hand covering her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered, her eyes wide with shock. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't the work of a typical predator. It was violent, excessive. And then I saw something strange. It appeared to be several bits of shredded cloth, like fragments of clothes. It looked like it was torn by force and not by cutting. I even caught a glimpse of something that looked like a portion of a hat, the type that park rangers often wore. All of the fragments were weathered, as if they had been there for some time. "Beatrice," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go." But before I could turn, there was a sudden movement in the bushes. I stepped back, my heart racing, and tripped over a root. I fell hard, my hand reaching out to break my fall. As I landed, I felt a sharp pain in my palm. I cried out, yanking my hand back. Beatrice was beside me in an instant, her face pale. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. My hand throbbed, and I could feel blood welling up. Beatrice took my hand gently, examining it. "There's something stuck," she said, her voice steady now. "Let me see." She pulled out a small first aid kit from her backpack and carefully cleaned the wound. As she did, I saw it, a jagged tooth, sharp and curved, embedded in my palm. It was large, at least 3 inches long, with an opalescent sheen that caught the light. It looked ancient, yet razor-sharp. "What is this?" Beatrice muttered, her brow furrowed. "It looks like a fong." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, my thoughts spiraling. Where had this come from? What kind of animal had teeth like this? Beatrice carefully pulled out the tooth, and I hissed in pain. The wound was deep, and blood flowed freely. She pressed a gauze pad to it, her hands steady. "We need to get you back to the campsite," she said. "This might need stitches." I nodded, though I knew it was more than that. Something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. As we made our way back through the forest, the trees seemed to loom over us, casting long, ominous shadows. The air felt colder now, the silence oppressive. We both considered just what could have done that, and worse if it was still in the area. Beatrice walked close, her arm around me, her warmth a comfort. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unblinking eyes were trained on us from the darkness. The forest, once a place of beauty and peace, now felt like a trap, a place where the lines between reality and nightmare were blurring. As we emerged from the trees and saw the campsite in the distance, I felt a wave of relief. But it was short-lived. The wound in my hand throbbed, a painful reminder that we could still be in danger of whatever had left that morbid scene. We discussed our plans, and I managed to convince her to stay for another night. I reasoned that it might have been a bear or something, and that we needed to take extra precaution that night, but that it should not spoil our entire trip. She agreed, somewhat reluctantly, and I felt bad, since I did not really believe my own rationalization. What's worse, I kept wondering why there were clothes near the butchered deer. Whatever did that couldn't have been human, but there were also no human remains. The air that night felt heavy and stifling. Even inside the tent, I couldn't shake the sense of being trapped. I knew we were just taking precautions for whatever might be out there, but I felt an even stranger sensation, like I just wanted to break out and run as fast as I could through the darkness of the forest and find something to eat. My imagination was jolted back to what was happening, and I felt the throbbing in my hand again. The wound, a jagged gash from the mysterious tooth, seemed to burn with a life of its own, but I wouldn't let it stop me. Tomorrow, by the waterfall, I would propose to Beatrice. The thought was a beacon, cutting through the haze in my mind. As night deepened, the forest outside came alive with sounds, hooting owls, rustling leaves, the distant howl that sent a shiver down my spine. Beatrice slept peacefully, her breath a soft rhythm against the stillness. I lay awake, my mind a turmoil of fear, but more disturbingly, hunger. The moon, a silver orb in the sky, called to me, its pull as undeniable as the tides it controlled. When sleep finally claimed me, it was not restful. Visions assaulted me, probing the forest, the earth beneath my paws, the thrill of the hunt. I was no longer myself, but a predator, driven by instincts raw and ancient. The moon loomed, full and brilliant, its light a cold embrace. I tore through the underbrush, the forest alive with my prey's fear. The vision faded, leaving me breathless and unsettled. Morning brought no relief. The wound was worse, the flesh red and swollen, emitting a faint, unnatural odor. Beatrice noticed my discomfort and frowned, but I brushed it off, not wanting her concern. Hunger gnawed at me, sharp and insistent. I devoured our stockpile of protein, the steak, sausage, and hot dogs. I could barely wait for them to cook on the smoldering campfire. The taste was raw and satisfying, yet it did little to quell the emptiness inside. Beatrice watched me with obvious concern, and I could tell that she was worried about me. I lied and told her I was fine, and that I had a surprise for our hike to the waterfall today. The hike to the waterfall was a blur of pain and resolve. Each step a testament to my determination to try and make the moment special. We had arrived and were both taken aback by the natural beauty of the stunning vista. We walked toward the waterfall and watched as it cascaded, a veil of white against the rocks, its roar a symphony of nature. The time was finally right, and I took Beatrice's hand. I pulled out the ring, and she knew what I was doing as soon as I knelt down. She started to cry as I asked her to be mine. Her yes was a whisper, a promise, and for a moment, everything else faded away. Unfortunately, the moment was fleeting. I suddenly fell victim to the worst headache I have ever had in my life. It was sharp and blinding. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't, and I almost toppled over. The world around me blurred and narrowed to a single point of agony, a searing pain that radiated from my temples to the base of my skull. I stumbled, my vision flashing with spots of light and dark, and before I could steady myself, Beatrice's hands were on my arms, her voice sharp with worry. Hey, are you okay? Oh my God, you're burning up, she said, her fingers tightening as she tried to keep me upright. I wanted to tell her I was fine, to brush it off like I had before, but the words caught in my throat. My mouth felt dry, and there was a metallic taste lingering on my tongue like blood. She guided me to a rock near the edge of the waterfall, the cool mist from the cascading water hitting my face and doing little to ease the throbbing in my head. I sat down heavily, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and pressed my hands against my temples as if I could physically push the pain away. Beatrice crouched beside me, her expression etched with concern. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a water bottle, unscrewing it with one hand. "Drink this," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "You're probably dehydrated from the hike and this fever." "I'm fine," I managed to mutter, but the words felt hollow even to me. My body felt wrong, like it was betraying me. The headache was unbearable, a relentless, pulsating ache that made every thought a struggle. And beneath it, that strange, gnawing hunger lingered, clawing at my insides like an animal trying to break free. Beatrice frowned, her eyes narrowing as she studied me. "No, you're not fine. You've been acting weird all day. First, the way you ate all that food," she hesitated, her voice softening. "And now this. What's going on with you? Is it the wound? Is it already infected?" I glanced down at my hand, the gash still raw and oozing despite the bandage. It pulsed with a strange, warm heat, and when I pressed on it, a sharp, burning pain shot up my arm. I winced, and Beatrice gasped, reaching for my hand. "Let me help," she said, her voice laced with the nurturing instinct I loved so much about her. "We should clean it again, maybe apply some more antibiotic ointment. I have some in the first aid kit, but if we need antibiotics, we're going to have to leave early. I am serious." She touched my hand, and I felt a surge of something primal and dark rise up in me, like a growl forming in my chest. I jerked my hand back, my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, I saw fear flicker in her eyes, and I hated myself for it. "I'm sorry," I said quickly, forcing a smile that felt foreign on my lips. "I'm just tired. Yeah, maybe dehydration. Let's head back to the campsite and rest, okay?" Beatrice hesitated, her gaze lingering on me as if searching for the truth behind my words. Then, after a moment, she nodded and stood back up. We started back for camp. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows twisting into forms that we watched and waited. I knew then that something was wrong. My head still throbbed, and my hand burned worse than before. But the worst part was the call, the anticipation of what was coming next. I felt a thrumming of energy in the ground beneath me that made the pain of my head abate. I closed my eyes as I stumbled along and saw the brilliant silver moon shining in a dark sky above. The call of the moon was more than just a vision. It was a warning, a harbinger of the horror that lurked within. I tried to articulate my vision to Beatrice, but I just let out an unintelligible mumble as we moved along. The night air clung to us like a damp shroud, heavy with the scent of moss and decay. The campsite was a fragile pocket of light, the fire spitting and crackling against the encroaching darkness. Beatrice knelt beside me, her hands gentle as she unwrapped the bandage around my hand. The wound pulsed with a sickly heat, the edges red and swollen, oozing a viscous fluid that gleamed in the firelight. "You need to see a doctor," Beatrice said, her voice soft but laced with urgency. She dipped a cloth into the water bottle, the liquid sloshing as she cleaned the wound. The antiseptic stung, but I bit back the hiss, not wanting to show weakness. "It's just an infection," I lied, though the pain was a relentless throb that echoed through every vein. The forest seemed to hum with it, the trees leaning in as if to listen. "We can't leave now." "Not yet." Beatrice looked up, her eyes reflecting the fire's dance. "We can't stay either. This could get serious." Her voice was a gentle push, but I felt the weight of her unspoken fears. I shook my head, the movement sharp. "Tomorrow. We'll leave tomorrow. But tonight, I want to see the moon." She hesitated, the cloth hovering over my foot. The fire crackled, spitting a spark into the darkness. "Why the moon?" she asked, her tone tinged with a mixture of curiosity and concern. I couldn't explain the pull. The way the moon's call resonated deep in my bones. It was a primal urge, a hunger that gnawed at me like the emptiness I'd felt all day. "It's beautiful here. I want to share it with you." Beatrice sighed, her shoulders relaxing. "Okay, but we are leaving tomorrow, no excuses." I nodded, relief washing over me. The forest seemed to breathe with me, the trees exhaling a collective sigh. The wound throbbed, but I ignored it, focusing on the warmth of the fire and Beatrice's presence. As she rebandaged my hand, the forest grew quieter, the usual nocturnal sounds muted. The darkness beyond the fire seemed to press in, alive and watching. I felt it in my skin, a crawling sensation that made me want to move, to run through the trees until the moon was overhead. Beatrice sat back, her eyes never leaving mine. "You're sure you're okay?" she asked, her voice a whisper of doubt. I forced a smile, the gesture feeling foreign. "I'm fine. Let's just enjoy the night." The fire crackled, casting shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. Beatrice leaned against me, her warmth a comforting anchor. But even as I held her, the forest called, the moon's pull growing stronger with each passing moment. I tightened my arms around Beatrice, holding her close as the night deepened and the moon climbed higher in the sky. Tomorrow we would leave. But that night, under the full moon, the forest would have its way. It was the worst mistake I would ever make. The moon was high in the sky, a silver sphere casting an eerie glow over our surroundings. The air was thick with mist, and the distant calls of owls echoed through the trees. Beatrice and I sat at the edge of our campsite, with the tent a dim shape behind us. The forest floor, carpeted in moss and ferns, seemed to hum with the night's energy. Beatrice leaned against me, her voice soft with concern. "Are you sure you're okay? You've gotten quiet all of the sudden." I nodded, though a shiver ran down my spine. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. The moonlight filtering through the canopy above seemed to pulse, and I felt an unfamiliar itch beneath my skin, like ants crawling through my veins. I tried to brush it off, attributing it to the strange wound on my foot, but the sensation only intensified, spreading through my body. Then the moon shone brightly, radiant and full. The pressure inside me was building, a relentless push against my ribs. My breath came in short gasps, and my vision blurred at the edges. The moon seemed to swell, its light burning brighter, hotter. Beatrice's hand found mine, warm and steady. "We should go back to the tent. It's getting cold," she urged. But I couldn't move. The compulsion was sudden, a primal urge to run, to escape the confines of our campsite. I tried to resist, gripping her hand tightly, but my legs twitched, muscles coiling like springs. The forest called to me, a wild, ancient voice echoing in my mind. I need to go," I stammered, the words barely audible. Her grip tightened. "What's wrong?" "You're scaring me," she said. My body jerked, a spasm ripping through me. I fell forward, catching myself on my hands and knees. The world spun, colors bleeding into one another. Moonlight was everywhere, blinding and suffocating. "Run," a voice growled, deep and unfamiliar, a voice that wasn't mine, yet it came from my throat. I pushed to my feet as Beatrice's cries echoed behind me. The forest swallowed me whole, darkness enveloping my senses as I ran. Trees blurred past, branches slicing at my face. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Each step was a pounding rhythm, driven by a hunger I couldn't name. Flashes of consciousness flickered through my mind. The earthy scent of damp soil, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, the burn in my muscles with every stride. Primitive urges surged as a savage hunger gnawed at my belly. I was no longer in control. Something ancient and horrible had taken over. Time lost all meaning as the world narrowed to the run, the hunt, the relentless need. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. I collapsed, gasping, my body trembling under the high, silver glow of the moon that now hung over a clearing, partially obscured by clouds. I lay on my back, the ground cold and damp beneath me. Blood caked my hands, and my clothes were torn and dirty. Memories came in fragments, the desperate run, the overwhelming hunger, the tearing of flesh. It wasn't until I sat up, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, that the horror hit me. A few feet away, Beatrice's body lay mutilated beyond recognition. Blood pooled around her, staining the earth. My breath caught as my mind reeled. I scrambled to my feet, staggering towards her. The wound on my hand throbbed, a constant reminder of the forest's touch. "No," I whispered, the word breaking in my throat. "No, no, no." I fell beside her, reaching out desperately but not quite touching, because the reality was too vast, too horrific. My body shook as I sobbed. I rocked back and forth, clutching my knees, while the forest remained silent except for my ragged breathing. The indifferent moon watched as my entire world was shattered. I lost track of how long I sat there. Time had lost all meaning. Eventually, in a haze, I staggered back to the campsite. The tent was seemingly untouched. I was lost and cannot recall how I ever got back. Now you know the truth. Somehow that Fong, the wound, the moon, it changed me. I consider the old tales of werewolves and laugh in despair as I think about this living nightmare that is my fate. That Fong, whatever it came from, it might be just like it worked in the stories. Apparently you did not just have to be bitten by a live one. The fangs themselves are a curse, and I am the victim. Beatrice, I will never forget you, no matter how badly I lose my mind to this curse. The new cycle is here. The full moon is imminent. It comes tonight. I leave this account of what happened as a warning. I am going to bind myself in a secure location and pray that I cannot escape and hurt anyone else. The call of the forest still echoes in my mind, a haunting reminder of what I have become. I know that the darkness will return, and next time, I might not remember anything at all. I can never forgive myself. Beatrice, I am so sorry. My name is Norman, and I would like to share a crazy, scary experience from the 1st of January of this year. So, after a joyful family dinner at my parents' place, I took the wheel at around 10:45 p.m. to drive my family back to our home. I want to point out that for the safety of my family, I did not dare to have even one drop of alcohol. On the way, my wife and I were having a casual conversation, barely listening to the low-volume radio, while our 3-year-old son was peacefully sleeping at the back. We reached a part of the itinerary where there is nothing but fields and grass on either side of the road. Nothing really out of the ordinary there for sure, except for the girl we spotted walking all alone along the road. We stopped talking on the spot, immediately struck with concern as soon as we saw her. Despite the cold, she had just a scarf on, a tank top, and a jeans short. That was it. She did not have any footwear whatsoever. We initially passed her since she did not pay us any mind anyway. She was busy making movements with her arms as if she was talking to herself while keeping her head down, her not so long blonde hair covering the upper half of her face. Before my wife asked, I stopped the car a few meters away from the girl as we thought that she really needed help, and we had to determine the best way to provide it to her. What had happened to her? I rolled down my window and peeked outside to watch her approaching as she was still not paying attention to us. That was the moment things took a really dark and terrifying turn. I could hear her clearly then, and unlike what I thought, she was not talking to herself. Instead, she was laughing. Laughing incessantly, without a pause, not a single word, just laughing while making those movements with her arms, movements that then looked strange. Not just any laugh too, the kind that results from a very good joke or a very funny scene in a comedy movie, but of course in that context, it seemed very bizarre and sounded manic. I called out to the lady, asking her if she was okay and if she needed any help, but still, no response from her. She was in a world of her own. Is she intoxicated? I thought. My wife heard her manic laugh too, and assumed that she might have mental issues or going through a mental breakdown of some sort, so we should call the emergency line. However, before we could do so, something strange happened. Her laugh started resounding through the radio, then through our phones, then through a talking toy at the back of the car where our son peacefully slept, well, not for long. Our son chuckled. We both looked at him as his shut lips curled into a smile accentuated by his still closed eyes, and he chuckled ominously like the overconfident villains in the movies, still sleeping and probably having the dream of his life. My wife first called out to him, trying to wake him up from his disturbed sleep. In the meantime, I noticed something much stranger. The laugh of the girl seemed to be patterned, repeating itself like a freaking recorded audio. And soon, I also noticed the same phenomenon about our son's chuckles. We were so distracted that we did not see the mysterious girl arrive at the rear door on my side, where she had stopped walking. As soon as we noticed her, my wife went into mom mode and wore a fierce look while trembling in unease, dominating her fear and signaling that she was ready to fight for her child. I once again peeked through the window, looking at the lady, and asked again if she needed help. The girl just stopped laughing all of a sudden. Everything went awfully silent, except for our son, who was then laughing uncontrollably with his eyes closed, still asleep. She then bent over, making her head visible through my open window, and slowly turned to us, revealing a disturbing smile consisting of a set of rotten teeth covered in blood. That was not the worst. I kid you not, the girl had no eyes, no nose, and probably no ears as well under her hair, just a mouth for her to laugh. My wife screamed in terror, snapping me out of whatever fear that paralyzed me, and I literally stomped on the pedal to storm out of there. The girl did not try anything. She just laughed even louder, and along with our son, synchronized with him and amused by the fear she had successfully induced in us. Her laugh once again resounded through the devices in the car until they returned to normal as soon as there was enough distance between us and that freak. Even our son did stop, sleeping peacefully again as if nothing had happened. I could not have hallucinated all that. Remember, I did not have a drop of alcohol, and my wife clearly heard and saw everything too. It has been weeks since the first, but we still cannot help ourselves from flinching when we hear a woman's laugh. We also avoid driving during the night at all cost. Look, whether you have had similar experiences or not, know that there are some really horrific and disturbing things out there, humans or not. We fortunately got out of the incident unscathed, at least physically, but many are no longer around to tell their tale. Please be careful. Another fortunate fact: since our son never woke up during the incident, we of course do not plan to tell him anytime soon. However, his laugh now sounds really strange sometimes. Jim was sitting in the break room when he heard the static crackle come across the radio clipped to his hip. Groaning, he started to stand up and stretch. He knew all too well what that sound meant, and that he was a second away from getting more work. In moments like these, he would have been happy to be wrong, but he wasn't. His boss's voice crackled over the radio. "There is a mess in the basement. Get down there and clean it up ASAP." Anytime they didn't say what the mess or issue was, he knew it had to be bad. He also knew from his boss's tone that it was better not to ask. "Yes, sir, I'm on it," Jim replied, brushing off his dark gray coveralls. He took one more second to himself, combing back his short brown hair with his hand. Then he grabbed his cleaning cart, dragging it towards the freight elevator. The staff always got an earful from the boss if they used the elevator for guests, even though the freight elevator was out of commission half the time. Jim was in no rush to get to his mystery mess. Pressing the button for the elevator, he watched the numbers count, thinking they could take as long as they wanted. As he waited, he started to let his mind wander off, thinking about what to do for dinner. He was quickly snapped back to reality by the ding of the elevator. Blinking his eyes reminded himself what he was doing. Sliding his cleaning cart to the back of the elevator, he clicked the elevator button for the basement. Leaning back against the wall, he watched the numbers tick down, counting to himself. As the elevator neared the basement, he gave a small push off the wall, straightening himself back up. An unsettling turning started in his stomach. He figured it was dread from the mystery mess to come, but then he looked back up at the screen counting down the floors. The elevator had gone past the basement, and the numbers were counting down into the negatives. Then strange symbols started appearing. Rubbing his eyes, he stared at the symbols, thinking he was seeing things or going crazy, but they didn't go anywhere. Suddenly the elevator came to an abrupt stop, almost toppling him over. The doors slowly opened up to a floor Jim didn't recognize. After working in the building for 5 years, he had sworn he'd seen every inch of the building at least twice, but now he was confronted with something new. A beige hallway that stretched out in front of him. He started to drag the cleaning car behind him, only to change his mind, letting it slip out of his hand. There wasn't any reason to take it with him. After all, this wasn't where he had gotten called down to. The cleaning cart drifted to a stop in the elevator doorway, and the elevator began to make an annoyed beep from the blocked doors. Jim didn't pay any attention to the sound. He started walking down the hallway, wondering where it led, and what in the world was down here. The hallway was surprisingly well lit, for there only being one overhead light off in the distance. Near the light there was something else, a dark part of the wall. At a distance Jim figured it had to be another hallway or a large stain on the wall. There was only one way to find out though, and his curiosity compelled him to check it out. He started walking towards the spot, only to find it was further away than he assumed. 5 minutes must have passed, and he didn't seem any closer to the spot. Was the hall some kind of optical illusion? Well, it couldn't stretch on forever. The thought of turning around hadn't crossed his mind. He had to know what was down on the other side of the hall now. Pressing on down the hall, the spot started to come into focus. It wasn't a stain on the wall. It was another hallway, or at least an alcove. That reassurance that it wasn't a complete waste of time gave Jim a boost of energy, speeding up his pace. Still, after another 5 minutes of walking, it started to feel strange that the hallway could be this long. Surely it had to be running under other buildings. Did the other buildings know what was under them? Maybe this was some forgotten system connecting them. As Jim got closer, he realized it was an alcove waiting up ahead for him. Nestled in the recess was a small tree that he suspected to be about waist high. The peculiar thing about the tree is that it wasn't in a pot. The roots had pierced right through the carpet and concrete floor. Tucked in amongst the roots was a small round lump the shape of a pine cone that Jim couldn't quite make out from where he was. The shape was too blurry to be fuzzy. After coming all the way down the hall, he figured he might as well see what it was. He knew he would already catch an earful from his boss about his little detour, but maybe his boss would understand. Did his boss even know about this place? If he did, he had never mentioned it. Walking towards the tree, it started to get larger and larger. So large, in fact, that it was the size of a full-grown tree cramped inside the hallway that seemed to be expanding. Was this another optical illusion of the hallway, or had he swapped sizes with the tree? As Jim pondered that thought, he realized the tree wasn't the only thing that had grown in size. The small lump that had been nestled in the roots of the tree was now the size of a boulder. Only it no longer looked like a pine cone. It was a massive ball of black fur that started to twitch and move. For large arms the size of a gorilla unfurled from the lump of fur. The midsection of fur parted open to reveal a maw of jagged yellow teeth, yawning open. Jim's heart was racing watching the creature stretch. He hadn't noticed any eyes and thought it might not be able to see him. This was more than Jim had bargained for. Keeping his eyes glued to the creature, he slowly started to back away. The radio on his hip started to crackle, and his entire body locked up. He raced to switch the radio off, but not before a mix of static and his boss' voice crackled out. The creature snapped to attention, facing the sound. Putting one hairy limb in front of the other, the creature started to slowly make its way towards Jim. Gritting his teeth, Jim walked backwards, trying not to make any more noise. The creature dragged itself forward slowly, closing the gap between them. Every foot forward it moved, the creature appeared larger than before. At the current pace, it was only a matter of time before the creature caught up to him. He knew nothing good would come from it catching him. Turning around toward the elevator, he did the only thing he could think of: run. Breaking out into a sprint, he ran as fast as his feet would take him, clattering against the floor. The creature picked up its pace, barreling into the hallway after him. Glancing over his shoulder, Jim could see the creature taking up the entire width of the hallway. Its fur brushed up against the walls as it ran after him. The elevator looked so close, but it felt like running on a treadmill trying to get back. He remembered the deceptively long walk out to the alcove and knew he would be in for a long run back. Pushing himself to run as fast as he could, he didn't look back, only focusing on the elevator up ahead. He could tell from the thunderous vibrations that the creature was still chasing him. Jim was starting to feel winded, and his legs were starting to cramp, but he knew he couldn't stop moving. The elevator looked so close now, but he knew that meant nothing. It was impossible to gauge how much running he had left before he'd reach the doors. All he could do was run and pray that he was faster. The last few feet of the hallway surprised him in an instant, sending him plowing full speed into his cleaning cart. Jim and the cart both slammed to the ground, sending an explosion of supplies scattering in the elevator. He knew he had no time to worry about that or the pain in his side. Fighting back up to his feet, he lunged at the control panel, pressing the door close button as fast as he could. Watching the creature barrel down the hallway, he was unsure what would win the race, the doors or the creature. The doors started to slide closed, and Jim let out a sigh of relief. A moment later, he could hear the creature hit the door, colliding at full speed. His relief was short-lived, realizing he hadn't selected a floor. In a panic, he slapped at all the elevator buttons. The elevator gears wound slowly, ascending, pulling the elevator back up. Jim couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he tried to pick up his supplies, setting them back in the cart. He couldn't worry about that right now. He sat on the floor panting, covered in sweat. Fumbling with the radio, he turned it back out and was immediately flooded with his boss's angry yelling. "Why aren't you in the basement yet? I accidentally got off on the wrong floor. I'll be right there, sir." "Is this you?" It started as a normal night. I was talking to my online friend on TikTok, just chatting like we always do. But this time, things took a turn I never expected. My friend messaged me saying, "Want to know a secret?" And of course, curious, I replied, "All right." He told me, "Go to your bathroom." I hesitated. I was tired, it was late, but my curiosity got the best of me, and I figured, why not? I dragged myself to the bathroom, placing my phone on top of the counter. That's when the weird part started. My friend began spamming smiley emojis, over and over. I laughed nervously, asking him to stop. Then he stopped. For a few seconds, it was silent. Just when I thought the weirdness was over, I got another message from him. "Smile." Without warning, my phone took a picture of me. I hadn't touched it, hadn't even moved. I stared at the screen, frozen, as the photo sent automatically to my friend. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't smiled. I hadn't moved. How could he have gotten that photo without me touching the phone? I panicked, trying to figure out what was happening. Suddenly, the phone started buzzing. I checked it, but there was nothing new. Nothing that made sense. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just a weird glitch. Maybe it was a dream. The next morning, I woke up confused and disoriented, unsure whether the events of last night had been a dream or something more. But the unease didn't go away. I opened my phone and checked the conversation with my friend. The messages were still there, but something didn't feel right. I scrolled back through our chat. There were no messages about the bathroom, no smile, and definitely no pictures. It was like that conversation never happened. I stared at my screen for a while, my stomach twisting. Could I have imagined it all? I decided to reach out to my friend to see if he remembered anything. "Yo, about last night, what HRE fuck was that?" A few minutes passed before he responded. What do you mean?" My chest tightened. He seemed so confused. "Dude, don't play. You told me to go to my bathroom, and my phone took a pic on its own." "I didn't text you last night. I wasn't even online." I felt my heart sink. "What?" I looked back at the chat, refreshing the page, scrolling up. There was no trace of the conversation we'd had. It was all gone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just sleep deprived. Maybe I imagined the whole thing, but it didn't feel like that. I knew what had happened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next night, the unease carried over into the evening. I tried to distract myself with other things, TikTok, videos, whatever, but the feeling kept creeping up. Then it happened again. I was lying in bed, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, when I felt it buzz. A message from my friend. I stared at it for a moment, my stomach flipping. "Check your gallery." The same words. The same command. My heart pounded in my chest. Not again. I didn't want to do it, but I had to. I opened my Photos app. Against every instinct in my body, my gallery opened, and the first photo that appeared was of me, just me sitting in my bed. But there was something off. I wasn't holding my phone. My hands were at my sides, and my head was tilted slightly to the side, as if someone else had taken the picture, and I had no idea who. I froze, my breath catching. The timestamp said the photo had been taken just 4 seconds ago. I glanced around the room, but nothing was out of place. The door was locked, the windows were shut. I was alone, but the photo didn't lie. It was taken just now. My phone buzzed again, another message from him. It was the exact same picture. "Is this you?" I was 14 the first time I remember someone dying. 2 blocks from my house, I was riding down the street and saw a man, motionless in his front yard, covered in blood. The man had just killed his family. Wife, 2 kids, their dog. Stabbed them each dozens of times, dragging them out the front door to be put on display for the neighborhood. It was a horror scene, but there was a crowd formed before the police showed up, and he didn't move. He just kept repeating, "The book made me do it." Soon after, he was catatonic. I don't think he ever recovered. The thing that stuck with me the most were his eyes. Wide, blank, like his mind had left before his body. I saw those same eyes in my bathroom mirror this morning, but I guess I should start at the beginning. I love used bookstores. The older, the better. The kind where the shelves are overflowing, and you can smell the history in the air. Dust, old paper, and a hint of something that could be mildew but feels more like memory. I found the book in a used bookstore I'd never seen before on the outskirts of my town. It was wedged between a laundromat that had seen better days and a place that sold knockoff vape cartridges. The kind of store that shouldn't still be in business, cash only, no receipts, and very few customers. Books were stacked floor to ceiling, the air thick with dust. $3 per book, no exceptions. I spent an hour scanning the shelves, running my fingers over the cracked spines, letting instinct guide me like so many trips to bookstores in the past. That's when I saw it. A faded red hardcover with no dust jacket. There was also no author name on the spine, just the title in gold letters, half peeled. Deeper goes the rabbit hole. I picked it up and flipped it open, expecting some bizarre take on Alice in Wonderland. No summary. No publishing date, odd. Just a single line scrawled on the inside cover. To those who seek the depths, may you find yourself within. I don't know why, but I felt like the book had been waiting for me, so I grabbed the $3 from my pocket and gave it to the wholly uninterested person at the front counter. I couldn't put the book down. The protagonist, no, that's not right. The villain was a man with 3 names and reminded me of the way serial killers and assassins are always named. He called himself the Scholar and was obsessed with lost knowledge. He wanted to understand the world's forgotten corners, the gaps in history that no one questioned. But as he dug deeper, he learned how to slip through them. I was really enjoying the read and noticed, scribbled in the margins of one of the pages was a weird handwritten note. If you start, you won't stop. Reality wasn't solid for the Scholar. He could unmoor himself from time, step through the cracks in existence. But the price was steep. He needed fuel, needed energy. Memories, experiences, lives. He started small. A whispered secret stolen from a stranger's lips. The taste of a childhood birthday cake, ripped from a man's mind. A woman's wedding day erased from existence, her husband left staring blankly, unable to remember why he felt so empty. The more he took, the less human he became. The more power he felt. I couldn't stop reading. The first time I lost time, I told myself it was just exhaustion. I had been putting extra hours in at the office lately. So maybe just stress, or too much coffee, but something felt off. I remember standing in my kitchen making coffee. Why are there 2 cups? I watched the clock click to 8 p.m. I blinked, only a blink, just once, and suddenly I was sitting on my couch, the book in my lap, my fingers curled around the pages. I looked at my watch, 11:45 p.m. I don't remember sitting down. I don't remember picking up the book again. My coffee was still in the kitchen, untouched, long gone cold. My legs ached like I hadn't moved for hours, but my mind felt stretched, like I'd been somewhere else entirely. And I was forgetting something so important. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, and I was sweating, but the air was cool in my living room. I should have been scared then. I should have put the book down or thrown it away. I was compelled to open it again. I lost time again, but this time I couldn't just chalk it up to exhaustion. I came to focus with the book on my chest, my fingers curled around the pages. My eyes felt strained, like they had been glued open and not allowed to close. Didn't remember anything past midnight. Was I alone? It's not unusual for me to read late into the night on weekends. It's my stress release and really my only hobby these days. That and taking care of something. I couldn't remember. I was too tired. I went to the bathroom to splash water on my face and looked up. My reflection didn't quite look like what I remembered. The angles of my face were too sharp and my skin stretched too light. My nails were longer too, at least a week's worth of growth. My lips were parted like I was whispering something, but I wasn't making a sound. And my eyes, there was nothing in my eyes. Just blank, black pits. No recognition, no me. Then my reflection blinked. I didn't. My own reflection blinked first. I stumbled back, knocking over my toothbrush holder. All 3 toothbrushes fell to the floor. My heart pounded against my ribs, every instinct screaming to look away, but I couldn't. I stood there, gasping, waiting for whatever was in the mirror to move again. It didn't. It just stared back at me, waiting, like it was eager for me to catch up. I backed out of the bathroom and turned off the light. I couldn't bear to see it anymore. With the room shrouded in darkness, I felt like I could move again. Panic set in, and I paced around my living room, stepping over the obstacles as I made my circular path, but I felt pulled to the couch where I had left the book. My phone rang and startled me to focus. My fingers were curled around the book, pressing into the pages like I'd been holding on for dear life. Wasn't I just walking? I grabbed my phone. It was a coworker. I almost let it go to voicemail, but a pit formed in my stomach. I answered. Hey, you okay? Her voice was tense, concerned. Yeah, why? Just tired. You called me like 5 minutes ago. You were whispering. I couldn't make out what you were saying, but it sounded weird. Like you were growling. My throat went dry. I don't remember calling her. Checked my recent calls, and there it was. A 2-minute call at 2:37 a.m. Must have been sleep talking I managed. Then why were you laughing? She asked, far more frustrated than concerned now. I hung up because any explanation would have made me sound crazy. Then I read the next chapter. The scholar was in a crowded marketplace. He brushed against a mother carrying her child, and the little boy ceased to exist. Not just dead, erased. The woman blinked, confused, staring at the empty space in her arms. As I read, I could hear it. The mother's scream. The absence of the child, crying out in some void just beyond the words on the page. And beneath it all, a breath against my neck. Did I have a child? I took another break, 5 a.m., to stretch my legs. I really should have gone to bed. Just put the book down and gone to bed, but a vague memory in the back of my head came to the forefront. I felt like it was violently pushed to the forefront. That man in his front yard. At some point I must have grabbed a knife because it was still in my hand, but I didn't have anything to cut. That was strange. Maybe one more chapter. Something shifted. The air in my apartment thinned. The walls seemed farther away. The book in my lap grew heavier, like it was sinking into my skin. And my eyes, I could barely see past the pages. My vision narrowed into a tunnel, and I couldn't close my eyes. They ached from dryness, but I couldn't blink. I know the sun must be up by now, but I can't see anything but this book. I heard my phone ringing, but when I picked it up, the voice on the other end sounded garbled. None of it made any sense, so I hung up. One more chapter. I think I know how this ends. I've already lost so much. I just wish I could remember what it was. I'm afraid to figure it out. My hands won't move. I can feel the strain in my muscles, the tension in my fingers. I tell them to let go, to drop the book, but they won't respond. They haven't been mine for some time now. I can't help but hyperventilate. Oh God, what have I done? My vision tunnels. The book is vibrating beneath my fingertips, humming with some horrible anticipation. The final chapter is waiting. I hear my phone ringing again. Someone is shouting my name through the front door, pounding against the wood, trying to get to me. I try to answer, but my body won't obey. It's not mine anymore. The sounds are all fading. I watch my own fingers turn the page. Oh God, no. The book made me do it. And I know soon it will find someone else. I grew up in a small town set in a bowl of mountains in the Appalachians. There was one 30-minute drive over the East Mountains that you could take to get to real civilization. But for the most part we stayed in Cat's Head. No one could really say why it was called that. Some said it was the name of an old moonshiner who had a cabin somewhere in the mountains. Others said it had something to do with the Indians, but didn't know why. I didn't know then, but I know now that people didn't get old here often. Round here most people don't know that there's anything else besides blue-collar work. You work here till you can't work anymore, then you take up your garden and live the simple life for the few years you got left. Chapter 1. It was the beginning of fall, the time when we get a few lost tourists driving into town, trying to find the Blue Ridge Parkway. I never understood how they wind up here in Cat's Head. You'd think at some point in the drive to nowhere you'd realize your mistake, but I always supposed the Parkway is a bit of a drive to nowhere. I was 25 years old, sworn in the year before by the new sheriff John Whitaker. He was the only candidate, as he was the only deputy at the time the old sheriff had tragically passed away in a car accident. So he was a shoo-in. Although young, John was a good man. We grew up together. He was a few years older than me, and if it weren't a town that you didn't know everybody, we might have been mistaken as brothers. Both blonde hair, blue-eyed, and dimples that our mothers always said ladies would love. But seeing as I didn't have a high school sweetheart anymore, I figured I was out of luck in that department in this town. I got to work that day, and John was already in our patrol car, an old lifted Jeep. Not great for transporting criminals, but we didn't do that nearly as much as we had to off-road to get to houses much like the one we were about to go to. Getting we got to go up the mountain to the Johnson's house. Had a call on the answer machine that sounded like Jenny Johnson. John told me as I got out of my car. Did he taste too much of his latest batch of moonshine? I asked semi-jokingly, as he was known to drink his product and slap Jenny around. He used to be able to get out of jail by promising to give the old sheriff a batch of shine. I suppose it was sort of posting bond, but it wasn't something John was going to put up with now that he was sheriff. No, all she said was, "He's dead, please get up here." Damn, no name or information. "You're sure we are going to the right place?" I asked as we pulled onto the road with the lights and sirens on. If I didn't know her distressed voice, by now I wouldn't be much of a cop. We drove up the small two-lane that lead back towards the real civilization of Henderson County before turning off and heading up a small dirt road that lead to the Johnsons. An abandoned car with out-of-state plates sat partway in the ditch beside the road. A white shirt hung in the window. "Was there a call about this car?" I asked. "No, but who calls 911 about running out of gas? Plus, unless you know our office's number 911 calls go to the next town over, so we probably would never hear about it. I'm sure they hitched a ride to town, and will get back here when they can." I suppose that's true. Just figured tourists would be the first to call us over being the dumbass that forgot to fill up before the parkway. I laughed. We pulled up to the Johnsons' house and got out of the car, walked up to the house, and knocked on the open door. "Sheriff's office." No reply. No movement in the house. "Go check the shed, I'll check the house," John ordered. I headed around the back, walked up to the shed. It was a small plank barn with the door open. Normally Kenny Johnson kept it padlocked as his beloved still was in there. "Sheriff's office." I called as I walked to the door, but there was no movement or response again. I walked in the door, the smell hitting me before my eyes realized what I was looking at. There was Kenny Johnson, the moonshining wife-beater. His body laying next to his still, his chest ripped open, and his intestines were hanging from the rafters like streamers at a party. I've seen my share of bodies in the short time as a deputy, but this made me spew my breakfast all over the grass outside the shed. I ran back to the front of the house just in time to see John step out of the open front door and do the same as me. "John, it's bad, Kenny, I don't know what I just saw." I puked again. The image of Kenny's body flashed in my mind. John stood up, wiping his mouth. "Jenny's no better." He pulled his phone out and quickly put it away. "No service." He paused a moment before putting his hand to his nose and going back inside. I followed him in, covering my nose. He went and got on the landline phone, dialed 911, and began talking with the dispatcher as I turned the corner into the living room and saw Jenny's open-mouthed, empty, but terrified gaze right in front of my face. Her head had been skewered on a nail that had previously held their wedding picture that now laid on the floor, broken frame. Her one arm hung limply by her side. Her other arm, now detached, lay on the floor on the other side of the room, looked as though it had been ripped clean off and thrown. The once blue nightgown she had on now was almost completely crimson from the blood that had poured from her empty socket. I stepped back, consumed by shock, and slowly walked outside. John followed after a while. "Mike! Mike!" John shook me, and I awoke from my thoughts, realized he had been trying to speak to me. "I said they're gonna send some guys from Henderson County, hopefully, should be here shortly." I've never seen any tea." "I have," John interrupted. "What?" I looked John in the eyes. "Sheriff Dunlap. The town was told it was a gruesome car accident. He was in his car when he ran off the road and hit the tree. But that's not what killed him. I found his footprints heading back up the hill before they stopped, and then I found him in a tree about 50 feet back into the woods past the wreck. His body was mangled just like this. Bite and claw marks all over his body. Bite and claw marks." I asked. I hadn't noticed anything at the time. There was bite marks on Jenny's arm, and her back had been clawed to ribbons. "I'm sorry I didn't take a real look before I had to get out." I stuttered. "I get it, Mike," he said, trying to keep me from going back into complete shock. Anyways, I tracked the beast that got Dunlap as best I could, but I lost the trail about a mile from the wreck. The paw prints were huge, bigger than any print I had ever seen. Just like these. He pulled me back into the house and pointed at the floor. There was a few huge cat paw print about 12 inches around. Following the prints out the door, I saw one print in the mud, a distinctive X scar right in the middle of the pad. "What is that?" I asked. "The panther. Like a black panther that everyone has grown up hearing wives' tales about." "Sort of. But this one is real, and it's not just some black mountain lion that people say they've seen. This one is older than even those myths. It's the same monster that hunted the early Indians. So it's thousands of years old." I asked sarcastically, trying to make myself feel a little better about the scene I'd just witnessed. "I don't know. All I know is it's a lot older than is natural or even possible. When we get done here, there's something I should show you." Some deputies from Henderson County came over and did the entire report for us, knowing we weren't equipped for an investigation like this. One of the deputies told us if we need help hunting this beast down, he could come out on when he's off if we get any idea on where it lives. EMS took the bodies into custody and brought them back to Henderson County, where the nearest hospital is. We thanked them all and left. On our way back down off the mountain, I remembered the abandoned car at the bottom. You think whoever's car that is okay? I stuttered, picturing another scene like the one I had just witnessed. I don't know, we can take a look around. We stopped past the car, and John ran the tag as I got out and looked around. Nothing out of the ordinary. Really did just look like he ran out of gas and presumably got a ride into town. I got back in the car. His name's Christopher Murphy, address listed out of South Carolina. You find anything? John said. Nothing. All right, well, let's go, John said, turning back onto the road out of town. It was our policy to let a car sit for a week before we towed it, as we had with many other cars along this road. Where are we going? Something I found hunting that thing. Is this where Dunlap died? It's close. He pulled the car over about 5 miles down the road and got out, grabbing the rifle from its locker. I got out of the car and followed him. We hiked in silence for about 30 minutes before coming up to the mouth of a shallow cave. John pulled his flashlight and lit up the interior. We walked into the cave, and John put the beam of his flashlight on the wall. Look familiar? He asked. An ancient painting of a paw in the middle of the pad was a very distinct X. Along with a picture of a black cat beside the print was a circle of stick figures around a fire, maybe dancing or doing some other ritual. I nodded in acknowledgement. I saw the same print in the mud when I found Dunlap. I had hoped it was just a strange coincidence at the time, but now I know it's the same beast. I brought you up here to prove it to you and to convince myself. I hoped I'd find something I missed the first time. I don't see anything else here, I said. No, but it did give me an idea. We can go to the reservation and see if they have any idea what this is. We hiked back down to the Jeep, my head filled with the thought of some mythical beast hunting in our backyard. We have about 4 hours of daylight left, and the reservation is 3 hours away. It may be a late night. I can drop you off at the station if you want, but I'm going with or without you. I've never been out that way, and I got nothing more important than this to do. Let's go. Chapter 2. We're here. John woke me up. I hadn't realized how tired I was when we got in the car, and I must have passed out immediately. We went to the tribal police department, told them our story, and although they did not seem to believe that it was some mythical beast, they did give us a name and address for someone who might help. We thanked them and headed to the address and knocked on the door. After a few moments, an older man opened the door. Can I help you? The old man angrily croaked. It was quite late, I realized. Are you Mr. Gwoniai? John asked. Yes, is there a problem? John held up his phone with the pictures of the painting in the cave along with the footprints from the scene. Do you recognize these? The old man stared at the pictures, his eyes showing some recognition. Come in and sit. He opened the door and we sat at his table. He has come back, Gwoniai said solemnly. These are the third killing that I have found in 2 years. If there have only been 3 that you have found, then you haven't been looking hard enough. Hearing this, my heart sunk. I thought of the bodies of the Johnsons, and then I thought of all the abandoned cars we had towed since I started. Were they all dead, and we never searched for them? Why were we never told? Did no one ever look for them? Were there locals that were mutilated in their homes like the Johnsons were? Who had I not seen in town recently? We call it Anasahoni. It has been here even before my people claimed this land. It was a mountain lion cursed by the gods for reasons unknown, turning it black as the night and giving it eyes of fire. It was a vicious monster that brought my people almost to extinction until the tribe's Ayunini created a ritual to fend off the beast. But it had costs. The people of the land could not grow old. The Anasahoni would feed on their spirit instead of their flesh. Has the ritual worn off? Why would attacks start again? I asked. It is possible. It would not be the first time. The Anasahoni had attacked my tribe not long before we had been moved to this reservation. It was believed that my great-grandfather had finally killed the Anasahoni and done what others before him had failed to do. He severed Anasahoni's head, and the tribe's Ayunini placed the head in the ground near where your settlers built the town. Cat's head, I blurted out, barely loud enough to hear. I received a glare from John. I apologized and looked down into my hands. They burned the rest of the body in one final ritual. With time, my people began to grow older again, and it had seemed like the Anasahoni was gone for good. But I suppose when the government moved my people, they moved it off the Anishoni's hunting ground. That's why we received our old age back. So how could it come back? John asked, confused. Do your people live long? Gowoni, I asked. I mean, I don't think I've heard of anyone in our town living much past 70, so I suppose not. John said, perhaps the Anisahoni has been feeding on your people's spirit since mine were sent to this reservation. So what can we do? I asked. We can try to kill it again. There was belief that it had worked the first time. Perhaps we can find a way to finally put the Anisahoni to death for good. The old man said, I will speak with the other elders, and I will call you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for your help, sir. John said as we got up and left the house. You drive, I need to sleep, John said, tossing me the keys and getting into the Jeep. The sun had set long ago. I drove home with much on my mind. My whole view on my life had changed in just a few hours, and fucking Jenny Johnson's face was burned into my brain. I pulled into the station and went inside. I was exhausted. I went into our single empty cell and collapsed onto the bunk. John apparently also decided that he wouldn't bother going home tonight either. He sat in his chair, propped his feet on his desk, and passed out. I noticed the light flashing on the answering machine as my eyes closed themselves, and I drifted off to sleep. Chapter 3. Get up, Mike, John said sternly as he was scribbling on a map of the county. What are you doing? I asked, rubbing the sleep from my eyes and grabbing a cup of the shitty coffee John had made. John said nothing and hit the answering machine. You have 3 new messages, September 29th, 2014 at 9:44 p.m. Hey Sheriff, it's Don King. I heard some shit going on up at Roger's house. Sounded like some woman screaming bloody murder. I don't know, it just seemed like something you should check out. Beep. September 29th, 2014 at 9:57 p.m. Hey, this is Henderson County Dispatch. We just got a 911 call that maps to a house on the far side of your county, belonging to a Donald King. It was a deadline, so we attempted callback multiple times. Bird didn't get an answer. Beep. September 30th, 2014 at 1:24 a.m. John, it's Erica. I think something happened to Jessica. She's not answering my calls, and I heard something down there about 2 hours ago. Can you check it out in the morning? Thank you. Beep. Fuck. I already called Henderson County. They're gonna send some deputies out to help deal with this. I'm leaving this for them to pick up, John said, not looking up from the map. Where are we going first? I asked, still rubbing sleep from my eyes. Where do you think? Erica was John's high school sweetheart, who had since fallen out of touch, and Jessica was John's sister. I knew the answer to my question before I asked it, but he was taking this a lot calmer than I would have, so I wasn't sure. I knew what we were going to find while we were heading up there. John was silent, his white-knuckled hands gripping the wheel. We pulled up to the house. John sprung out of the car and didn't bother doing a call-out as he barged into the house. I followed after him, gun in my hand. I found him in the mess that was once a bedroom, crouched over the crumpled remains of Jessica Whitaker, a woman I had always looked up to. She was a big sister to John and I both. She was a Marine and had been able to put up a good fight. As good a fight as you can put up in a cramped bedroom, I suppose. There were tufts of black hair and blood of the panther all over the room. She looked like she was sleeping peacefully. The pool of blood under her said otherwise. A large bite in her side was her only fatal injury. I picked up a bit of the hair. It looked as though it had been slashed off, not ripped, but there was no knife to be found. I could see the handgun that had been in the bedside table that now lay on its side in the middle of the room. The pistol had slid under the bed. Are you going to be all right? I asked. When this thing is dead, he said, standing up. I could see the tears in his eyes. She probably saved a lot of lives. I mean, we didn't get any more calls after her attack. Maybe she injured it enough to make it go lick its wounds for the night. He turned and walked out of the house quietly. I left him alone and got on the phone and called in EMS to pick up the body. I went to the car, grabbed the camera, and took some quick pictures for the later report, but I knew we wouldn't be staying here too long. When I exited the house, all I could hear was the faint crunch of leaves up the mountain. John was already about 100 yards away, tracking the blood, and turned up leaves from the injured and fleeing panther. Before I could follow, I saw a patrol car pulling up. The deputy rolled down the window and called out to me. Hey bud, I answered a call for you guys while we were there picking your map. Some guy from Cherokee said he needed you to call him something about a solution or something. He handed me a scrap of paper with a number written on it. I thanked him, ran after John. John, Gowoni, I found a way to kill it. John turned. What do we need? Seemingly angry that I had interrupted his hunt or possibly his thoughts. I don't know, he asked us to call him back. I spat out quickly. I handed John the paper. He pulled his phone out and dialed the number. What do we need to do? John asked. Uh-huh. Okay, see you soon. He put his phone back into his pocket. John picked up a few sticks and made them into an arrow on the trail of the panther, and then turned to walk past me back to the car. I followed quickly, and we both got in the Jeep and head down the mountain towards town. What's the plan? I asked, scared to upset the man who was normally stoic, but now looked like he could break down at any second. Do you have any silver? We need to make some bullets. I think so. Chapter 4. I pulled the box from under my bed and retrieved a roll of silver quarters that had been given to me as a birthday gift as a child. I ran back outside and hopped into the Jeep. John threw it into reverse and flew back down my driveway. We were on our way back to the station when I asked again how he was holding up. John coldly said, "I'm fine." I know he was lying, but it was nice to know he was still with me and hadn't completely broken mentally. We rode in silence the rest of the way to the station. John got out and immediately went into the garage. I didn't go in there much, never had much need. It was used as impromptu evidence storage and was full of boxes of reports dating all the way back to the 70s. John threw some boxes out of the way, exposing an old reloading press and beside it a metal kiln. He brought a propane tank over and attached it to the kiln and started it up. I opened the garage door without a word. We had the bullets made before Gwoniai arrived. We had 16 rounds of silver 30.06. I loaded them up in our old riot control rifles from the 50s. 2 surplus M1 Garins that the sheriff at the time, a former paratrooper, had relieved from the army before he got out. I then loaded them into the Jeep. Gwoniai arrived escorted by a tall, sturdy man with a knife in his belt named Kanadi. Gwoniai explained what he had found out to the group. The curse laid on the Anasahoe is similar to that set on the Wendigo, so we will treat it as such. Silver bullets should kill it, and if they don't, we will try fire. John called up Henderson County. When your deputies finish up the investigations over here, ask them to spend the night at our station. If they do not hear from us by noon tomorrow, they need to evacuate the town. I'll leave my list of all the citizens on my desk. Thank you. We all packed whatever gear we thought we might need and got into the Jeep and headed back towards Jessica's house. I'm sorry about your sister, Sheriff. Gwoniai said solemnly. I had told him before we got in the car. John glanced at me. She's in a better place. Gwoniai continued. She's in a broken pile on the floor in her bedroom, John said through gritted teeth. I could see tears building in his eyes. She no longer belongs to this cursed world. Her spirit is free. She walks with your ancestors now. We're here, John said coldly as he pulled into the driveway. Please do not curse yourself because of what this demon has done. Gwoniai pleaded. We got out of the Jeep, grabbed our rifles and gear, and started up the trail passing the X John had made earlier. We tracked the long, dried blood trail all day. We were deep into the mountain to the west of town when the sun finally set. Turning on our flashlights, we continued on at a slower pace. By about 1 o'clock a.m. we arrived at the mouth of a deep cave. Inside the cave were large piles of leaves. John went in and kicked over the smallest pile, nearly tripping when his foot hit something hard inside. He brushed away the leaves and revealed the half-eaten carcass of a deer. I swept the leaves off a larger pile and quickly backed away, bringing my rifle up to my shoulder. The face of an open-mouthed black bear stared back at me. It's how big cats keep their kill fresh for longer. Kanadi spoke for the first time since we left the station. John swept away the last pile of leaves, the feet of a human appearing from it. I helped him remove the leaves from the body. Neither of us recognized his bloated and bloodied face. I checked his pockets and pulled a wallet out. Flipping it open, I read out loud, Christopher James Murphy. Guess we gotta tow that car after all, John said, making a morbid joke that I was still happy to hear. We continued on our path into the den of the panther. Chapter 5. Bones littered the floor as we walked deeper into the darkness. Some animal, but some human. Some of the skulls looked ancient, yellowed from the pass of time. Others looked fresher, still having hair and bits of dried skin left on them. Had any of these people died doing what we were doing right now? Is there any hope for us? I thought to myself as I stared into the empty sockets of a skull in front of me. The cave wasn't a smooth-walled cavern you see in movies. The walls were jagged where the mountains had collided into each other millions of years ago. Lots of corners where the beast could be laying in wait for us. As hard as we tried to be quiet, the crunch of bones breaking beneath our feet echoed through the cave. As the cave narrowed into a small arch, John stopped, and pulled his bag from his shoulder, retrieving a package from inside. Opening the package, he pulled out a stick. A road flare? No, dynamite. This is our last resort and our fallback position, he said, placing a stick at the base of Arch. He carefully placed a few sticks around the area. Guwoniai, if we fail to kill the panther, I want you to light this and run. He whispered, handing the old man a lighter and putting a fuse inside the last stick and placing it on a rock near Guwoniai. I hope it doesn't come to that. But good luck, Guwoniai said. As we started through the arch, Kanati began muttering something that sounded like it should have been a chant. The three of us continued on. The air was stale and moist, and the stench of death was all around. We were here. The beams from our flashlight moved around rapidly, hoping to get a glimpse of the cat. It wasn't here. I finally breathed for what felt like the first time since we entered the cave. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips as I slowly lowered my rifle. What are we? The blood-curdling screech echoed through the cave loud enough to deafen us. Kanati began sprinting back the way we came. I could faintly hear the sounds of a man screaming through the ringing in my ears. John and I followed after Kanati. Before we had made it back to the archway, Kanati was thrown into the roof of the cave somewhere behind us in a quick blur of the panther's paw. My flashlight went to the beast. Its black fur seemed to dissolve the light. Its head was bigger than my chest. Ruby red eyes stared through my soul. Most shocking was its face. What little flesh it still had was rotten and barely clinging to its yellowed skull. Just behind the beast's right ear was a K-bar plunged handle deep into its neck. Jessica's knife. John had already begun shooting when I came out of my awestruck daze. I began to empty my clip into the black blur that now lunged at me. I don't know how many of my rounds hit it before I was thrown towards the wall. As I flew through the air, I heard the distinct ping of an empty M1 Garand. I hit the wall and lost consciousness. I don't know how long it had been when I woke up, but I could hear a struggle still going on. I crawled to my flashlight that was laying 10 feet in front of me. Picking it up, I found my now broken rifle. I turned too quickly, nearly passing out again from the blood rush. As I regained my senses, I ran towards the back of the cave, passing Kanati, whose head had been caved in. When my light found them, John was on the back of the panther, one arm wrapped around its neck, the other K-bar in hand, plunging it repeatedly into the panther's chest. The panther ran into the walls, trying to get the sheriff off his back. Below the cave. I'll be right behind you, John shouted. I turned and ran back to the arch. The dynamite sat on the rock where John had left it, but where was the lighter? I flashed my light around the room, trying to find Guwoniai. I could still hear John cursing the panther as I found Guwoniai's body face down on the floor. I rolled him over and opened his clenched fist, pulling the lighter from his grasp. Come on, John, I called as I ran back to the archway. The panther's scream once again echoed through the cave, disorienting me. I picked up the dynamite, put my light towards the back of the cave, and wait a second. Do it. I heard the sheriff call out as he came into view in a full sprint. I lit the fuse, gently placed it on the rock, and began running back towards the mouth of the cave, tripping after a few feet. My flashlight dropped and lit up behind me. I turned my head to see John making it through the arch. A flash of black consumed him. I picked myself back up and ran through the darkness until I could see the light coming through from the rising sun. I felt the quake from the explosion under my feet before the shockwave picked me up and threw me into the woods. Epilogue. I don't know whether or not we finally killed the panther once and for all. My aunt celebrated her 80th birthday last month, and we haven't had any more gruesome deaths in 10 years, so I'm hopeful. When I woke up in the woods that morning, the air was filled with the smell of sulfur and burnt flesh. My adrenaline had worn off, and I finally felt the holes in my side where the panther had slapped me into the wall. I hobbled my way back down the mountain to the Jeep and drove back to the station, catching the Henderson County deputies before they began evacuating everyone. As we waited for the ambulance, they informed me that Don King and Roger Williams and his family were all found deceased the night before. They would go check the cave to see if they could collect the bodies of my team. I had passed out from blood loss before the ambulance arrived. I woke up in the hospital, and the doctor told me I had a bad concussion along with a ruptured eardrum, 5 broken ribs, along with 5 deep puncture wounds on the right side of my chest. The day I was released from the hospital was the day of John's funeral. It was an empty casket funeral, as his body was still buried in the mountain. The whole town was packed into our little Baptist church. John's parents were inconsolable as they watched their second child get buried in a week. I told them their children had saved the lives of everyone in this room. I had hoped that it was true, and the panther was truly gone for good. I watched as my friend's casket was lowered into the ground. I threw the first shovelful of dirt onto the casket before leaving. It started with a loud, shrill tone, the kind that instantly throws your body into panic mode. My phone vibrated so violently that it tumbled off the nightstand and clattered onto the wooden floor. The sound sliced through the silence of my darkened room, yanking me out of sleep so fast that my heart felt like it was slamming against my ribs. My ears were ringing, my breath was uneven, and for a split second, I thought I was dreaming. But the glow of my phone screen, stark against the darkness, told me this was real. I knew that sound. It was the emergency alert system, the one usually reserved for extreme weather warnings, amber alerts, or national security threats. My mind raced through the possibilities: an earthquake, a storm, something urgent. But as I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers, my groggy brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. Emergency alert. Do not sleep, that this is not a test. Do not fall asleep under any circumstances. Stay awake until further notice. The bold red letters glared at me, the message burning itself into my brain. My first reaction was confusion. Do not sleep. What kind of alert was this? My mind scrambled for an explanation, a prank, a system glitch, maybe even some bizarre government drill. My vision was still blurry from being yanked out of sleep, but I forced myself to focus on the time at the top of my screen. 2:43 a.m. Before I could even process the first message, another alert flashed across my screen, the same piercing sound making my whole body jolt. Repeat, do not sleep. They are present. A cold shiver crawled down my spine, slow and suffocating. They are present? The words made my stomach twist with unease. Who were they? I sat up straighter in bed, my pulse thundering in my ears. My apartment was still, wrapped in that eerie, suffocating silence that only exists in the dead of night. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I quickly checked my phone for more details, news updates, emergency broadcasts, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No reports. No social media posts. Just that warning. I wanted to believe this was some elaborate hoax, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the message itself. It was the way my body reacted to it, like an unspoken instinct was telling me to listen. Then I heard it. A sound. Faint at first, but undeniable. A wet, dragging noise. It came from outside my bedroom door. I froze mid-breath, my entire body locking up. It was slow, deliberate, unnatural. Like something heavy being pulled across the floor, but with a sickening, sticky quality that made my skin crawl. My apartment wasn't big. I lived alone in a small one-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor. There shouldn't have been anyone else inside. For a moment, I considered calling out, asking if someone was there. But something inside me screamed not to. My body tensed, my heart hammering so loud I swore whoever, or whatever, was outside could hear it. I reached for my bedside lamp out of habit, but my fingers hesitated over the switch. If someone or something had broken in, turning on the light might alert them that I was awake. My throat was dry as I slowly pulled my hand back and instead reached for my phone, gripping it like a lifeline. I slid out of bed, careful to keep my movements slow, controlled. My bare feet barely made a sound against the floor as I crept toward the door. The dragging noise had stopped. I strained my ears, waiting, listening. Nothing. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Maybe it was the pipes, or the neighbors upstairs moving furniture. Maybe I was still groggy, and my brain was playing tricks on me. I exhaled, trying to calm myself. Then my phone vibrated again. Another alert. If you hear them, do not open your door. Do not let them know you are awake. My entire body went cold. Them. The word burned into my mind, twisting into something far more terrifying than just a vague warning. My stomach lurched, my hands trembling as I took a step back from the door. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know who or what they were. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't about to test the warning. Moving as quietly as I could, I locked my bedroom door and shoved a chair under the handle. My breaths came in short, ragged bursts as I backed up, my legs finally giving out as I sank onto the bed. My heart was slamming against my ribs, my body rigid with fear. One thing was certain. I wasn't going to sleep now, even if I wanted to. A soft knock broke the silence. It wasn't loud or hurried, just a gentle, deliberate tap against the wall. But even that small sound sent a spike of panic through me. My entire body tensed, my fingers tightening around my phone. My front door remained closed, untouched. That wasn't where the knock had come from. No, it had come from the wall. My neighbor's apartment was right next to mine, separated only by a thin layer of drywall and insulation. The knock had come from his side. The realization made my skin prickle with unease. It wasn't some random noise from the building settling or pipes shifting. It was intentional. Someone was trying to get my attention. I didn't answer. For a moment, silence stretched between us. My mind raced, torn between dread and curiosity. Then finally I heard his voice, muffled through the wall, but unmistakably human. "Hey," he said, his tone hushed but urgent. "You awake?" My throat was dry. I hesitated, my pulse hammering, before forcing out a whisper. "Yeah. Did you get the alert?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah." A pause. Then, quieter now, almost as if he was afraid someone, or something, might overhear. "You know what's going on?" "No clue," I admitted. My voice was barely more than a breath. Another pause. Then, with an edge of fear creeping into his tone, he said, "But I think there's something in my apartment." A chill swept over me, deep and immediate, like someone had emptied a bucket of ice water over my head. My fingers curled so tightly around my phone that my knuckles ached. "What do you mean?" I whispered. "I heard something," he said. "In my living room." His breathing was uneven, shallow. Like footsteps, but not normal. I felt my stomach tighten. Not normal how? There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost too soft to hear. Dragging. Slow. I squeezed my eyes shut. The exact same noise I had heard outside my own bedroom door. The same wet, deliberate dragging sound. My pulse roared in my ears. "I locked myself in my room," he continued. "I don't know what to do." I flicked my gaze back to my phone screen, rereading the warnings. "Do not sleep. Do not wake them." The words felt heavier now, more sinister. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. "Did you see anything?" Silence. A long, uneasy silence that stretched too far, filling me with an unbearable dread. My mind ran wild with the possibilities. What was he seeing? Why wasn't he answering? Then, finally, he whispered, "I think my roommate fell asleep." A sinking, suffocating feeling settled in my stomach. "He's in the other room," he continued, his voice barely more than a breath. I heard him snoring, and then he trailed off. My fingers trembled. "Then what?" "The sound," he said, and I could hear the raw fear in his voice. "It changed." My breath caught in my throat. "Changed how?" Another pause. I could hear his breathing on the other side of the wall, rapid and unsteady. Like breathing, he finally said, "But wrong. Too deep. Too wet." A violent shudder rippled down my spine. My fingers clenched around my phone so hard my nails dug into my palm. I wanted to tell him it was nothing, that it was just his imagination, but I knew that wasn't true. I knew because I felt the same choking dread creeping through my veins. Then another alert came through. My phone vibrated so hard it nearly slipped from my grasp. If someone has fallen asleep, they are no longer them. Do not let them out. I sucked in a sharp breath, my entire body locking up. I nearly dropped my phone as a fresh wave of panic surged through me. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might give me away, thought whatever was lurking might hear it. Then through the wall, I heard a new sound. A deep, guttural wheezing. It was slow and rattling, thick with something wet and clogged, like a body struggling to suck in air through lungs filled with liquid. It wasn't normal breathing. It wasn't human breathing. My neighbor whimpered. A raw, choked sound of pure terror. "Oh God," he whispered. "It's at my door." Then came the scratching. Long, slow drags of fingernails, or something worse, against wood. I pressed my ear to the wall, barely breathing. Every muscle in my body was locked up, tense, like I was made of stone. I told myself I just needed to hear what was happening, to confirm that this wasn't some nightmare or my imagination running wild. But the moment my skin touched the cold surface, I regretted it. The wheezing grew louder. It was thick, wet, rattling through something that barely seemed capable of holding air. It came in uneven bursts, dragging in a breath too deep, exhaling with a sickly shudder. But now there was something else. A new sound. Clicking. Soft at first, like fingernails tapping against wood. Then sharper, more deliberate, like someone, or something, was flexing stiff joints, cracking bones into place. And then I felt it. Something pressed against the other side of the wall. A shape. Solid. Tall. A head. My stomach turned to ice. It was right there, inches away from me. I jerked back so fast I nearly fell. My skin crawled as if something invisible had brushed against me, and my entire body recoiled in disgust. I didn't want to know what was standing there. I didn't want to know what was breathing so close to me. Through the wall, my neighbor was still whispering frantically, his voice shaking with panic. "It's trying to open my door," he said, his words barely more than a breath. "It knows I'm in here." A heavy thud rattled the wall. I flinched. Then another. It wasn't just knocking, it was ramming the door. Hard. I clenched my fists, my pulse hammering so fast it felt like my chest would burst. My mind screamed at me to do something, but what? I didn't even know what we were dealing with. A home invasion? A hallucination? Something worse? Then my phone vibrated violently in my hands. Another alert. Do not interact with them. Do not speak to them. They are not who they were. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept what that message was saying, but deep down, I already knew. This wasn't just some emergency drill. This wasn't a joke. Whatever was in my neighbor's apartment, it wasn't human anymore. His whisper came again, even more desperate now. "I think I can make a run for it," he said. His breath hitched. "I can get to your place." "No," I hissed, cutting him off. My fingers gripped my phone so hard they ached. "Don't. The alert says." A loud crack shattered the air. I jolted. His door had splintered. The noise that followed made my blood run cold. A step. A wet, sickening step. Like something heavy, something drenched in fluid, had stepped into his room. My neighbor inhaled sharply. Then silence. A long, horrible, suffocating silence. I pressed my knuckles to my mouth, biting back the urge to call his name, to do anything. But I didn't move. I barely even breathed. Then, just when I thought the quiet was worse than the noise, a click, right against the wall. My stomach twisted into knots. And then I heard him breathing. But it wasn't him anymore. I sat frozen on my bed, my phone clutched so tightly in my hands that my fingers had gone numb. My body felt like it wasn't even mine anymore, as if I had turned into something hollow, something incapable of movement. Every part of me screamed to run, to hide, to do something, but all I could do was sit there, paralyzed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The wheezing breath on the other side of the wall filled the silence, slow and rattling, thick with something wet. Each inhale dragged in too much air, too deep, too unnatural. Each exhale was worse, like it was forcing something wrong out of its lungs. Then, my phone vibrated again. The sound, even muffled, felt deafening in the silence. My stomach twisted as I forced my gaze down to the screen. "Do not make noise. Do not let them know you are awake." A sharp jolt of panic shot through me. My breathing hitched as I turned off the screen, plunging my room into darkness once more. My entire body ached from how tense I was. I pressed my lips together, forcing my breath to slow, to quiet. Then, the breathing moved away from the wall. My stomach dropped. It wasn't leaving. It was moving toward my door. Soft, shuffling footsteps brushed against the floor, dragging ever so slightly, just enough to make my skin crawl. My ears strained to track every sound, every pause. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom. Then, a single gentle knock. I thought my heart had stopped beating. Then a voice. My neighbor's voice. "Hey, you awake?" The exact same tone. The exact same way he had spoken to me through the wall. If I hadn't known any better, I would have answered. But I did know better. It wasn't him. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hand over my mouth to stop any sound from slipping out. My body trembled violently. A second knock. Louder this time. "Hey, let me in." I could hear the wrongness in it now. The cadence was slightly off. The words lingered too long, stretching just a little too far. My fingers dug into my skin as I fought the urge to scream. I didn't answer. Then, I heard the doorknob rattle. Slowly. Testing. A soft click. Then another. Like it was trying to see if I had been careless enough to leave it unlocked. My gaze flickered to the chair I had braced under the handle. My mind raced. Would it hold? The rattling stopped. Then a new noise. A long, dragging scrape. I bit down on my lip so hard I tasted blood. Something was being pulled down my hallway. Something heavy. The sound was slow, deliberate, stretching out in agonizing, unnatural intervals. My imagination ran wild with possibilities. What was it? What was it carrying? I forced myself to stay still. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to do something. Hide, run, push furniture against the door. But I knew better. I knew that any movement, any noise, would let it know I was awake. Then my phone buzzed one final time. "They can only stay until dawn. Do not let them in. Stay awake." I clamped a hand over my mouth, my shoulders shaking as silent tears welled in my eyes. So that was it. If I could just hold on, if I could just wait, they would leave. For the next few hours, I listened. The thing outside my door never knocked again. It didn't call my name. It just waited. Every now and then, I heard it shift. The soft, sickening wheeze of its breath. The faint clicking sounds, like something moving wrong inside of it. Like it was adjusting itself, waiting for a chance, waiting for me to slip up. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating. I didn't dare check the time. I didn't dare move an inch. Then, just as the sky outside my window began to lighten, silence. I didn't move. I couldn't move. An hour passed. Then two. Finally, when the sun was bright in the sky, when I could hear birds chirping and distant cars rumbling down the street, I forced myself to move. My entire body ached from staying in the same position for so long. My throat was dry, raw from holding back my breath. I moved the chair away from the door. My hands shook violently as I unlatched the lock. I hesitated. Then I opened the door. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, leading away from my door, were long, wet footprints. I stared at them, my breath caught in my throat. They stretched all the way down the hall, disappearing around the corner. I couldn't tell if they were barefoot or something else. The news had no answers. No one did. There were whispers online, forums, scattered social media posts. People were sharing the same experience. The same alert. The same warnings. Some people didn't make it. Some doors weren't strong enough. And some let them in. I don't know what happened to my neighbor. I never saw him again. I never heard him again. But I know one thing. Since that night, I don't sleep easily. And when I do, I always wake up to the sound of breathing, even when I'm alone. I've kept this secret to myself for a long time, afraid of what would happen if I ever spoke it aloud. But I can't keep it in anymore. It's become too much to bear. Even if revealing it means facing consequences, I'd rather endure whatever comes than continue living with this haunting every day. I'm writing to this community, hoping that maybe someone out there will understand what I'm going through. I can't be the only one who's had to endure something like this. Right now, I'm locked in my room, trying to put all of this down in words, something that's been eating away at me for what feels like forever. I need to get it out. If anyone has gone through anything like this, maybe I won't feel so isolated, so lost. I don't know how much longer I can carry this weight without letting it out. I'm a single dad. My wife, Maria, passed away from cancer, and nothing in this world can truly prepare a man to lose the love of his life. There is no preparation for watching your child say goodbye to the woman who meant everything to both of you. For a long time, it felt like the world had come to a complete stop. Every day felt like an eternity. But I had to keep going for Adam, our son. He needed me. We live in Julian, California, remote, rural, and peaceful, far from the noise and chaos of city life. I made the decision to move us here, hoping it would give us some space, some quiet time to heal. And while the silence was welcome, it was never truly quiet with a 6-year-old. After I dropped Adam off at school, the house would feel empty, and I'd have time to reflect, to think about Maria, to wish she were still here. I'd think about her, our life together, and how the memories of our son's crazy imagination filled the house with so much life. His endless adventures, his tales of galaxies far away, the way his mind would wander and create stories so big that I could never keep up. It was as if his creativity was inherited straight from Maria. He had my looks, my eyes, but his heart and mind, they were all hers. Sometimes it felt like a piece of her still lived on in him. Every night, we'd sit together, watch a space-themed movie, and then step outside to gaze at the stars. Adam always had this special connection to the sky. He'd point out constellations, tell me facts he learned in school, and go on about the planets, about how one day he'd like to travel there. I'd carry him to bed afterward, his little hands clutching my shirt as I tucked him in. It was routine. It was comforting. But it wasn't always enough to fill the space that Maria left behind. That was until one night when everything changed. It began like any other evening. Adam and I were outside, lying on the cool concrete, our gazes fixed on the stars above us. He rambled on, as he always did, about space, the stars, his thoughts spinning out faster than I could keep track of. But then something shifted. For a few moments, Adam fell completely silent, his eyes wide, unblinking, as he stared at the sky with an intensity that I had never seen before. It was as if he was no longer in the moment, his mind somewhere far beyond, lost in thought. I called out to him, and slowly he snapped back to reality. He lifted his arm and pointed up at the sky, his lips curling into a faint, almost knowing grin. "Daddy, the stars are dancing tonight." His voice was soft, almost as if he was talking to himself, not to me. I turned my head toward the sky, expecting to see a plane, maybe a flashing light, something to explain his words. But there was nothing. Just the same peaceful sky, the same stars, all of them stationary and calm. I figured it was just his imagination at work, as it so often was, and decided it was time to bring him inside. He didn't seem to notice, his eyes still fixed on the window, watching as if he was waiting for something. After a bit of TV to wind down, I stepped outside on my own, needing a moment of solitude. I stared up at the sky, letting my mind drift, remembering Maria, wishing she was still here with me, with us. I lost track of time, my thoughts consumed by her, by the memories we had made together. And then something happened. One of the stars, one that had been perfectly still the entire time, suddenly darted in a direction that made no sense. It wasn't a shooting star. I knew that much. My mind tried to rationalize it, to explain it away. Maybe it was my eyes playing tricks on me. Maybe the dark sky had fooled me into thinking I saw something. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That star had been motionless, perfectly stationary, and now it had moved. And the unease settled deep in my chest, something in my gut telling me that things weren't as simple as they seemed. Part 2, Dreams. It's important for anyone listening this to understand that this moment marked the real turning point for me. As an adult, it's easy to dismiss the strange things a kid might say, especially when that kid has an overactive imagination. I regret that now. Looking back, I see how foolish I was for not taking it more seriously, for allowing myself to think it was just one of Adam's creative flights of fancy. But things started to build after that night, the night Adam called the night the stars danced. At first, everything seemed normal. Life continued on as usual, and the stargazing rituals didn't change. Adam didn't mention anything strange about the stars again, and I figured it was just another one of those moments where he let his imagination run wild. As the school year wound down, I began putting Adam to bed a little earlier. He wasn't thrilled about it, of course, but the melatonin seemed to help. One minute, he'd be complaining about how unfair it was, and the next, he'd be fast asleep, as though the exhaustion of the day had hit him all at once. It made our nights shorter, but I still made sure to spend as much time as possible with him during the day. We had our adventures, most of which involved Adam taking off to distant planets in his mind, while I was left behind. He always promised me it wasn't anything personal, but it didn't stop me from feeling a pang of loneliness when he talked about his journeys. Life, however, went on, until one night when everything seemed to shift. I had just finished closing the blinds for the night, preparing to settle in for bed, when I heard the familiar patter of bare feet against the hardwood floor. I turned around, expecting to see Adam just coming out of his room, but what I saw sent a wave of dread through me. Adam was standing at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes glazed over, his body unnaturally stiff. He wasn't awake, not fully anyway. He was sleepwalking, and I had never seen him do that before. Maybe his sleep schedule or the melatonin had something to do with it, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved. I approached him cautiously, thinking I'd gently guide him back to bed. But before I could touch him, his arm shot up, his finger pointing straight ahead at the door. His posture was rigid, like he was frozen in place, like he wasn't aware of his surroundings at all. The sight of his unmoving finger, pointing so deliberately, sent a chill through me. I followed his gaze to the glass door, but there was nothing, just the usual quiet darkness outside. The house was still, and everything appeared normal. But the feeling that something wasn't right lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside, trying to shake the unease that clung to me. The night air was cool, and the distant howls of coyotes echoed from the mountains, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I stepped further into the yard, trying to dismiss the growing sense of dread. Then something caught my eye, something I couldn't ignore. Just beyond the concrete, a patch of dirt seemed out of place. It was compacted, forming an odd, deliberate shape. It looked like 4 shoes had been arranged in pairs, with the dirt raised slightly around them. It was too neat, too purposeful to be the work of an animal. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, maybe something else. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random. A sense of unease gnawed at me, growing stronger the more I tried to push it away. The house was isolated, so far from our nearest neighbor, and the idea of someone being out here didn't make sense. The prints were too big to belong to a person. While a bear could have left a mark, the shape still didn't sit right with me. It felt like someone or something had been standing there waiting, watching, The next morning, I asked Adam if he remembered sleepwalking. He looked at me with confusion, just as puzzled as I was. "Sorry, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. "I didn't mean to confuse you. I've just never seen you do that before." I tried to lighten the mood. "How'd you sleep?" "Good," he replied, grabbing his book bag and heading toward the door. "I had a dream I was in space and made friends with an alien." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my voice steady. "Oh really? What did you and the alien do?" "We traveled the universe, and they showed me cool things. I even got to be one in the dream. I came back to say hey, and was pointing at you from outside, Daddy." My blood ran cold. I tried to mask my shock, but inside, everything froze. How could he know about the pointing? I had never told him about it. I hadn't mentioned the strange sleepwalking, the way he'd been pointing at the door with that strange, unblinking gaze. How could he have known? I drove him to school that morning, my mind racing. Part of me was terrified to be alone in the house, but I knew I couldn't let it control me. He was just a 6-year-old boy, and I told myself it was probably just another one of his wild stories, his way of impressing me or pulling a little prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper, something that couldn't be explained. What unsettled me the most, though, was that Adam had known. He knew, and that terrified me. Part 3, Sleepwalking. I apologize for the shortness of the last couple of parts. My memory isn't great, and honestly, these memories are hard to recall. I understand it's important to express these experiences fully, not just to help you understand what we went through, but also so I can leave them behind. I'm sorry if the next parts are longer, but I can't keep leaving out details that will only haunt me if I don't share them. I could have told Adam about what happened when he sleepwalked, but I didn't want to scare him. He probably would have thought it was cool, but I didn't want him to sense that I was worried or freaked out. I went on with my days, and over time, the fear morphed into the idea that it was all just a weird coincidence. I kept giving Adam his melatonin before bed, hoping it was the source. That night, I checked in on him before sleep. He was curled up in his bed, snoring away, and I closed the door with a sigh of relief. I figured the previous night was an anomaly, nothing more. Later, as I settled into bed, I felt my body and mind begin to relax. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. I opened my eyes and sat up, assuming it was Adam knocking at my door. With a sigh, I got out of bed and shuffled over to open it. To my surprise, Adam wasn't there. I stood for a few seconds, confused, before the tapping came again. This time, I noticed it seemed to echo through the house, faint but rhythmic. Tap, 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 tap. The noise was precise, almost coordinated. I walked over to Adam's room, opened the door, and scanned the dark room. He was still nestled under his blanket, sleeping soundly. I checked the other rooms upstairs, no sign of anything unusual. The tapping paused briefly, then resumed, almost like it was on a timer. Both our rooms were upstairs, and there weren't any trees nearby, so I ruled out a branch tapping on the window. I made my way downstairs, and the sound grew slightly louder. It had to be some animal or something else outside, maybe the wind pushing a bush against the window, or even a bird pecking. We always left some lights on, so my eyes adjusted quickly as I walked through the darkened house. When I got to the kitchen, the tapping stopped again. I flicked on the light, but everything in the room looked normal, nothing unusual at all. I checked the fridge, the dishwasher, and the rest of the kitchen. Nothing. As I stood by the counter, I started scanning the shadows that played on the walls. It's strange how shadows shift when the light outside flickers, but then I saw something. One shadow, an elongated hand, slowly began to rise, stretching upward. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, too terrified to move. The hand grew larger, as if it was approaching the window, and just as it reached its peak, I heard the tapping again. Tap, 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 tap. My heart raced as I turned to the window. I saw nothing. I rushed to it, looking out into the empty night, but all I saw was dust swirling in the breeze. My mind was racing, trying to find an explanation, when I noticed something in the dirt just in front of the house. The same compacted patch from the last time. The shape was identical, about the size of 4 shoes, arranged in 2 pairs. My stomach churned as the questions flooded back, but they were cut short when I heard something behind me. I turned quickly, grabbing the nearest knife and facing the sound. To my shock, it was Adam, sleepwalking again. I set the knife down, frustrated and confused. As I picked him up, I watched in disbelief as he moved toward the same spot I had just been standing. He climbed onto the counter and stood, facing the window. The tapping started again. Tap, 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 tap. I rushed over and grabbed him off the counter. "Adam, what the hell are you doing? Do you think this is funny?" I shouted, anger boiling up inside me. But Adam just looked around, confused. "Daddy, what are you talking about? Why did you bring me in here?" he asked. I snapped. "Stop with the crap. I don't know why you're doing this, but enough is enough." As soon as I yelled, his lip quivered, and his eyes filled with tears. He started crying, and it hit me. I had crossed a line. I looked down at his arm, and saw a dark red mark where I had been holding him too tightly. Guilt washed over me. I hadn't meant to hurt him, but I had, out of fear. I pulled him into a hug and apologized, but it took a while for his sobs to calm down. Once he stopped crying, I carried him back to my room, making sure his arm was fine. I had almost lashed out at him for something that wasn't his fault. The next morning, I asked him about the sleepwalking, but of course, he didn't remember anything. I didn't bring up the tapping or the shadow. I didn't want to upset him. We spent the day watching movies to make up for the night, but all I could think about was what had happened. That night, I knew I wouldn't sleep. The image of the hand on the wall haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, playing some twisted game. I thought about installing cameras, motion detectors, anything to make sure Adam was safe. I was determined to find out what was happening, but that night, as I drifted off to sleep on the couch, the sound of the movies acted as a lullaby. I wasn't sure what it was, but I was going to make sure that Adam was safe, no matter what. As sleep finally took over, the last thing I saw in my mind was the image of E.T., reaching out with his glowing finger, touching the boy's finger. Little did I know, that image would forever haunt me. Part 4: Voices. After installing the cameras and motion detectors around the house, I made sure to set up everything I needed on my phone to alert me. I was determined to catch whoever the hell had decided to come to my house. Adam's life had already been impacted by Maria's death. I didn't need another thing to affect him. I just had to hope that whoever had been there hadn't been watching me put up the devices during the day. After spending the day with Adam, the orange hue of the sunset began to overtake the house, and the shadows stretched long across the walls. I still felt guilty about Adam's bruised arm from the night before, so I let him sleep with me that night, hoping it would help him forgive me, and so he wouldn't be alone. I figured that if he did sleepwalk again, at least I'd be able to see everything, and maybe figure out what was going on with him. Even though it took longer for him to fall asleep, I didn't give him the medicine. It seemed to be a common factor in his recent behavior. After about 30 minutes of tossing and turning, he finally laid still, and I continued to stare at the phone screen. From what I could remember from the night before, the sounds had started around 2 a.m., so I made sure to stay up until 3. I was a light sleeper, so even if I nodded off, the alert on my phone would spring me awake in a heartbeat. I waited, reading the book I'd been meaning to finish for what felt like a year. I checked the time after what felt like an eternity of pages. It was 2:30 a.m. Still nothing. Adam hadn't moved an inch since he'd fallen asleep, and my phone stayed silent. Maybe whoever it was had seen me set everything up and decided to back off. Or maybe, just maybe, they were waiting for the perfect time. I waited another 30 minutes. Still, everything was quiet. It seemed like a normal night. I placed my phone beside me in case of any alerts, rested my head on the pillow, and before I knew it, I was passed out. The darkness of sleep enveloped me. I didn't know how long I was asleep, but it felt like mere minutes when I was suddenly jolted awake. My eyes flew open. The clock read 4 a.m. I looked down to see the blanket had been moved. I turned over to face Adam and gasped. There he was, standing on the bed, his eyes closed but facing the door. He was standing straight up, as if he had been placed there. His arms were firm by his sides, and his body was rigid, like a soldier at attention. I froze, staring at him for a few seconds. I checked the door, still closed, and continued to watch in stunned silence. Minutes passed, and he stayed in the same position. Finally, he stepped off the bed. I slowly sat up, careful not to disturb him. Adam stumbled, his movements unsteady, as if he was just learning to walk. He made his way toward the door, and I quietly followed. He stopped at the door, just standing there. I wanted to wake him up, but something held me back. I had to see what he was going to do next. Silence stretched in the room, lasting what felt like 10 minutes before I began to hear faint whispering. I crept closer to him, straining to understand what he was saying, but the words were unclear. His lips moved so fast it was hard to keep up. When I was just a foot away from him, I froze. His eyes, wide open, stared at the door ahead, never blinking. His mouth moved faster and faster, as if he were talking to someone on the other side. Then I heard it. Another voice, identical to his, but slightly louder. My heart hammered in my chest. It was coming from the other side of the door. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear, but the voice was still too quiet. There was no alert on my phone, no movement in the house. Yet someone or something was on the other side. My mind raced. The only other way into the house was the chimney. No human could have gotten up there without a ladder, and I would have seen them on the camera. That terrible thought, someone was speaking to my son, not at me. Slowly, I lowered myself to the floor to peer under the door, trying to get a glimpse of the intruders. I could barely make anything out through the crack. Two objects blocked the light. They were too large to be human, but they seemed to match the shapes of the imprints in the dirt from the previous night. Before I could process what I was seeing, the whispering stopped. The room went completely silent. Adam raised his hand and placed it on the door, his fingers tapping softly. The same tapping I'd heard the night before, but this time it was slower. I stared, horrified, when a second tap echoed in the hallway. The sound was almost vibrating in my ear. I knew it had come from the floor, the same floor I was lying on. I dared not look. I knew whatever or whoever it was on the other side had seen me, and I was being watched. I slowly moved my eyes back to the floor, and there, staring at me from the crack, was an eye. A deep, dark eye. Its pupil was not round, but formed into a disfigured triangle, unlike anything I had ever seen before. I was paralyzed with fear. My gaze locked with the eye, unable to look away. Then, another tap came from the other side, vibrating through the floor beneath me. Tap, 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 tap. In a flash, the eye disappeared, and heavy, fleshy footsteps echoed down the hallway. I shot up, grabbing Adam and pushing him out of harm's way, then slammed the door open to chase after whatever it was. Down the stairs, I saw the dents in the walls where it had made its escape. I raced to the fireplace, only to find the ash scattering, a sign of its departure. Panic gripped my chest. I rushed back into the room, only to be met with a sight that froze me in place. Adam stood at the doorway, his body trembling with an unnatural force. His mouth was stretched wide, and his hands gripped the edges of his lips with such intensity that I could see the skin pulling and tearing. His fingers dug deep, his nails almost digging into his own flesh as he tried to force something out, something I couldn't even begin to understand. His eyes were rolled back, revealing nothing but the stark white of his sclera, veins running like twisted rivers across his eyes. The sound that escaped him, it was inhuman. A guttural screech from the depths of hell, so raw and terrible it seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. In a moment of terror, I rushed forward, grabbing his arms with all my strength to stop the horrid torment he was inflicting on himself. He was relentless, though, his screams turning into desperate sobs, his hands still pulling at his mouth as if trying to escape some unseen force. His body jerked in pain, but I held him tight, desperate to stop the damage he was causing. As his eyes fluttered closed, his body slumped into my arms, unconscious, but the room felt like it was collapsing in on me. Suddenly a sound, something monstrous, screeched from above. A terrifying noise echoed from the roof, like something scraping and dragging itself across the tiles. It was relentless, the roof groaning under the weight of whatever was moving on it. Then, the unmistakable sound of tiles crashing down filled the air, some of them shattering against the pavement below. The violent clatter of debris struck the ground, but it didn't stop. The creature, or whatever it was still moving, as if it was tearing through the house from above. I could feel the tremors in the walls, vibrating through the very foundation of the house. The sound of heavy, fleshy limbs scraping against the roof grew louder, more frantic. Then, without warning, the sound shifted to the same horrific screech Adam had made, echoing above, but now it was the creature's voice, sending chills down my spine. I knew what had to be done. I had to protect Adam, and I couldn't let go of him. My phone started blaring with the alerts from the motion detectors, the camera alarms going off one by one, but I couldn't take my eyes off Adam. I couldn't risk letting him out of my arms. That thing was still here. The motion detectors screamed through the house, but just as quickly as they started, everything fell into silence. The camera alerts stopped, the sound of the roof and the creature's chaos ceased. It was as if the house had fallen completely still. Adam's breathing was shallow in my arms as I sat there, frozen, not knowing what to do. The once deafening alarms on my phone had stopped, and the eerie quiet pressed in on me like a heavy weight. Then, slowly, Adam's eyes fluttered open, confusion written across his face as if nothing had happened. He looked at me, his expression shifting to one of concern. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. The fear, the confusion, the overwhelming terror. It all poured out as I collapsed against him, shaking uncontrollably. Part 5. Adam. It was difficult to explain what had happened. Adam was confused about why his mouth hurt, why the walls had strange indents in them, and why I was crying. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. How could I explain something so horrifying to a child? If he knew that something had nearly gotten him, how could he ever feel safe again? I told him it was just sleepwalking, that he had rubbed his mouth raw, though I knew it was something much darker. As for the marks on the walls, I said I'd fallen down the stairs. If he were any older, the lies wouldn't have worked, but I needed him to believe me to stay calm. I wanted to leave, to run as far away as possible, but I couldn't be sure the thing wouldn't follow us. The last thing I wanted was to put anyone else in danger. I needed to protect Adam, and I needed to understand what this creature was, what it wanted with him. The next morning, I found the motion sensors and cameras I had set up all broken, lying on the ground. I checked the footage, but all I saw was a quick blur before the lens shattered. Whatever it was didn't want to be seen. The noises from that night, Adam's screams, the voice of that thing, it still echoed in my mind. I couldn't shake it. That day, I bought new cameras and motion detectors, including ones for the roof. The chimney had been damaged, and I found debris the next morning. I set up the new equipment, working through the morning until I was sure everything was secure. As night fell, I took every precaution I could think of. I moved furniture against doors, told Adam it was for a bad storm. He didn't question it, and went back to his movie. I couldn't afford to let this thing get any closer. Every second felt like an eternity. Adam sat there, absorbed in his movie, unaware of the nightmare creeping closer. He was so innocent, so safe in his little world, while mine was falling apart. When the movie ended, Adam fell asleep on the couch next to me. I kissed his forehead and turned off the TV, sitting in the silence, waiting. The clock showed 2 a.m. I knew it was out there. I stood up and checked the cameras. Nothing. I felt the weight of the silence. The crickets outside, the only sound, offered no comfort. They were just a reminder that I was alone. Then the crickets stopped. A chill washed over me, the kind you can't ignore. I felt it in my gut. It was close. My phone vibrated. I checked the alert. Motion detected at the front porch. My heart raced as I opened the camera feed. In the distance, a figure stood in the shadows. Tall, thin, its limbs twisting in unnatural ways. It knew I was watching, like it wanted me to see it. The figure bent and contorted before crawling back into the darkness. I felt nauseous. I returned to Adam, still asleep on the couch, but just as I sat down, the phone buzzed again, another alert. This time, I heard the crash from the front porch. The light flickered, and then went dark. Another crash, louder this time, and I realized the camera had been destroyed. Something had thrown a rock at it. I wouldn't let it bait me. I couldn't leave Adam. Minutes passed, and then I heard it, whispering. At first, too faint to make out, but soon it grew louder. The voice stopped at a level just low enough for me to hear it clearly. And then I felt it, something moved beside me. Adam was awake. The whispers were for him. I knew that if it got close enough, it would do something horrible. I pulled Adam close, holding him tightly, whispering to him, "Everything is going to be okay. I won't let you get hurt. I love you." The whispering faded, replaced by silence. But then, from the darkness outside, I heard it, my voice, twisted and evil. "I'm not going to let you get hurt, Adam." It sent a cold shiver through me. The voice was guttural, wrong, like it had been tortured, yet it sounded strangely like me. I tried to keep my composure. "I don't know what you are, but you can't have my son. Get out of here." The silence was deafening, then suddenly a heavy slam against the door. The house shook. The knocking started again, soft at first, then with more force. Each knock became harder, more desperate, until the door rattled violently. Adam began to cry. "Adam!" I ran to the door, shoving the chair I had placed against it, but the eyes, two glowing points, stared back at me from the other side. Even though I couldn't see the face, I could feel the rage. I ran back to Adam, holding him as tightly as I could, trying to comfort him, but the yelling from outside was unbearable. The house felt like it was shaking apart. We both screamed, the world feeling like it was collapsing around us. Then suddenly, everything went silent. I uncovered my ears, confused. No sound, only our breathing. I opened the curtain to check, and the porch was empty, the camera broken. I sighed in relief, pulling Adam into my arms. It was over. I pulled away and held his head between my hands as I smiled and kissed him on his forehead. A smile illuminated off his face, and I felt as if I was once again looking at my wife. I hugged him and scouted around the house to make sure that nothing was there. Once I felt good enough to say that it was just us, I made my way out of my bedroom and began my walk down the stairs. I stopped for a moment and looked at the indents that the monster had left and thought of how much we had been through and started to cry. I gathered myself and began my walk back downstairs when I felt a buzz in my pocket. A familiar alert echoed in the staircase, and I pulled up my screen to see the alert that made my whole body feel limp. Motion detected on the roof. A second later, I heard the ripping of tiles and the loud screeching of metal being torn apart at the top of the chimney. I instantly started to run down the stairs with tears still in my eyes. I turned the corner and ran into the living room to see Adam standing near the chimney with the TV remote in his hand. His smile illuminated the room, and he looked at me with such joy that it made the tears fly out of my eyes more and more quickly. I knew now that it had waited just for the right time, just in time for Adam to be in reach. I had to be quicker than it. I had to. With all my force, I started to dart to him and reach out my arms, screaming at him to come to me. A look of confusion filled his face, and I started to see the rocks and ash from the chimney fall to the ground behind him. "Daddy, I just wanted to see if you wanted to watch." Just as my fingertip was an inch from his hand, I watched as a long and scrawny arm came from the chimney and wrapped around Adam. With precision and quickness, I watched as fear struck Adam, and he began to scream before the arm jolted him into the brick, smashing his head against the hard chimney entrance. Then both the arm and Adam disappeared into the chimney ahead. With all the momentum, I fell onto the ground in front of the chimney as blood dripped onto the floor around me and onto my hands. I screamed in agony as all I could hear from the opening ahead was the screaming of Adam getting more and more distant as the thing carried him far away. I needed to share this to get the story out to the public. I have never seen that thing again, and I hope I never do. Every second, I think of Adam, of Maria, and how I could have done more. I couldn't protect them from the dangers that exist both in this world and beyond it. I beat myself up for it every waking moment. If you're listening to this, don't feel sorry for me. I deserve this. Each night, I stare into the stars and think of Adam, wondering where he might be. Sometimes, I hope that Maria and Adam are looking back at me. But deep down, I know I don't have that certainty. That thing got what it wanted from me. It tricked me. I'm sharing this story as both a message and a warning to the world. We are not alone. And that thing, it walks among us. April stared out the window at the endless stretch of black woods. The trees nodded together like they were whispering to each other. Murphy lay curled in her lap, ears twitching, his nose pressed to the glass like he could smell something rotten. Nathan, one hand on the wheel, the other holding his phone, was already streaming. "All right, chat, welcome to the most haunted Airbnb in America," he said, grinning. The chat flooded in, messages scrolling up the screen so fast April couldn't read them all. "What's the story? Is this legit or clickbait? Dude, this place has bad reviews, El Mayo." "Oh, it's real," Nathan said, his voice dripping with the same performative confidence he always used to hype up a new investigation. This place was home to one of the most brutal murders in state history. April sighed quietly. "Do we really have to?" Nathan ignored her and kept talking to the stream. "Chat, let me take you back to 1976, he continued. "A guy named Richard Halloway lived in this house with his wife and 2 kids. Small-town guy. No criminal record. Just your average, quiet, church-going dad. Until one night, he wakes up and butchers his entire family with a hunting knife." Murphy whined. April shifted uncomfortably, pulling her hoodie tighter around her. Nathan kept going. "But here's the thing," he said, voice dropping into his storyteller tone, the one that always made the chat eat it up. "After killing his family, Raymond wrote something on the walls in their blood." He glanced at April. "Babe, tell him what it said." April sighed, gripping the phone as chat erupted with guesses. "Demon stuff? Red rum. 666 to 666, 666. She cleared her throat and read the words that had haunted old police reports ever since. "The house whispers. It told me to." The chat exploded. Nathan grinned, seeing the viewer count spike. "And here's the kicker, Raymond was never found." A pause. April hated this part. The part where the story didn't have an ending. "The police searched for weeks," Nathan said, turning onto the long dirt road leading to the Airbnb. "Dogs, helicopters, full manhunt. No body. No sign of him. It was like he just walked into the woods and vanished." Murphy growled, low and deep in his throat. April felt a chill creep up her spine. Nathan didn't notice. Anyway, he said, that was decades ago. But every guest who's stayed there since? They all say the same thing. April could already guess. Nathan let the silence hang for dramatic effect, then said it. The house still whispers. By the time they reached the house, the sun had almost set. The cabin stood in the clearing like a thing waiting with its mouth open. It wasn't run down, but it wasn't right either. The kind of place that looked normal at a glance, but the longer you stared, the more it felt wrong. April's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen. One new comment on Airbnb listing. She clicked it. It was from 3 days ago. We left before midnight. Do not stay here. It doesn't want guests. It wants something else. Murphy refused to get out of the car. April hesitated. Nathan was already setting up the camera. Inside, the house was cold. Not just temperature cold. April had stayed in plenty of drafty, abandoned places before. This was different. This was the kind of cold that settled in your bones, like walking into a mausoleum. Murphy's nails clicked against the wooden floor as he stayed pressed against April's legs, ears twitching. Nathan ignored it all. All right, chat, let's see what we're dealing with, he said, grinning at the camera. He held up his EMF meter. The light flickered red. April's stomach clenched. Nathan grinned. We have company. And then, faint as breath, she heard it. A sound that wasn't coming from Nathan. A sound that wasn't coming from the wind. A sound that was coming from the walls. Whispering. By midnight that night, the house was doing more than whispering. The live stream's chat was going insane. Nathan had tried everything throughout the day. EVP sessions, spirit boxes, even the classic, knock twice if you can hear us trick. Something had knocked. But now Nathan was bored, which meant he was about to do something stupid. All right, chat, he said, motioning to the camera with finger guns. Time to take this to the next level. April's stomach dropped. Nathan clicked a button. For the next hour, every donation over $20 will be read aloud using our AI voice generator. Let's see if we can make the ghosts talk back. The chat exploded. $20 donation from GH0STHunt3R. April, dump him. $30 donation from Skibidh10. Boobs, $30 donation from horrifying0925. OL Dick Halloway is a weak sauce ghost. Your family's better off dead than hanging with him. $50 donation from Anonymous, it feeds. April stiffened. Nathan, she said slowly. Turn it off. Nathan frowned. What? She pointed at the chat. Who sent that? Nathan scrolled. The message wasn't there. Only the AI voice had spoken it. Then the screen glitched. More messages poured in, too fast, all from Anonymous. The AI voice changed. It wasn't reading donations anymore. It was chanting, over and over. Mori, Phi Corpus Meum, Dimit me. The room went ice cold. Murphy whimpered and bolted upstairs. Nathan's mouth started moving in sync with the AI voice emanating from his computer. The laptop screen flickered. April's heart skipped. The chat was still pouring in, taunting, laughing, but suddenly the words stopped. The screen went blank for a heartbeat before the bright red glow erupted in her face, like the bloodshot eyes of something evil staring straight at her. The text began to appear, crimson, jagged, in English, as if burned into the screen, each letter searing through her skull. Die. Become my body. Set me free. Her breath caught in her throat. The words flashed bright red, almost like a warning, a bloody message from the depths of hell itself. April yanked the power cord. The stream died. Nathan screamed. April's heart pounded in her chest. She grabbed Murphy, shaking as she ran for the door. Behind her, Nathan's screams echoed through the cabin. They sounded wrong, like they were being distorted, like something was taking him. She couldn't look back. Her hands fumbled with the door, slamming it open, the wind outside biting at her skin as she ran. Murphy was already ahead of her, his paws beating the earth like he knew the way. They didn't stop running until they were back at the car. April's hands shook as she started the engine. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She drove until the sun broke on the horizon. Then drove some more. April pulled into a small, dimly lit roadside diner, her hands still shaking as she dialed 911. Please, her voice cracked. There's something wrong at the Halloway house on Cedar Ridge. My boyfriend, you need to send someone. I don't know what's happening, but please hurry. They found nothing. No sign of Nathan. No equipment. No broken window where she'd escaped. The house was immaculate, like it had been scrubbed clean of the last 24 hours. And the Airbnb listing? Gone. April demanded answers. She pushed for another search. She begged them to check again. A few days after the house was investigated, April was able to obtain the Airbnb owner's phone number from an email thread she had found on Nathan's account. She called them. The phone rang too many times before a voice finally picked up. An older woman, calm, polite, a little confused. "Hello." April gripped the phone tighter. "Hi, is this the owner of the cabin on? I'm sorry, the property is no longer available for rent." April's throat tightened. "I know. I stayed there last week. And something happened. My boyfriend went missing, and the police said they didn't find anything, but I know what I saw." A long pause. Then the woman sighed. "I'm sorry, dear, but I don't know what you're talking about." April's stomach twisted. "What? You must be mistaken, dear. The seclusion in those woods isn't for everyone. Some say when the wind picks up, it whispers." April almost dropped the phone. Another pause, and then the woman laughed. Soft, pleasant, like April had just told her something funny. April's hands shook. "But the house is just a house, dear." A click. The line went dead. 2 weeks after the call, April was scrolling through audio production jobs on her phone when it buzzed in her hand. Murphy tilted his head and quietly laid down, eyes fixed on April's expression. The push alert on her phone read, "The Nightmare Files is now live." She felt sick and immediately clicked it. The stream opened. Nathan, or the thing that was masquerading as Nathan, stood in the Airbnb's empty living room, smiling. "You can't run forever, April." Murphy started barking, screaming at the phone. Nathan tilted his head. "I'll find you." And then, with a flicker of static, the stream cut to black. Humanity one day met up close the one unsolved mystery it could never fathom. Up until the early 2030s, the ocean was a mystery. Due to the lack of funding for ocean research, it was nearly impossible to discover everything the water had to offer us. However, soon after new satellite technology was developed, we found a way to record selected areas of the deep ocean through a new type of sonar technology. Deep wave was essential in the discovery of over 2,000 separate species of whales alone, and countless other specimens as well. Its only downside is that it worked in sound only, not allowing us to immediately identify a new species by its looks. This led to multiple unmanned missions down the deepest portions of our world. Still though, with this new technology, we only had mapped and discovered around 75% of what we believed the ocean could contain. That's when I was tasked by the Department of Deep Sea Analysis to control our first manned mission to a newly discovered anomaly that deep wave was not capable of identifying fully. Similar to the Marianas Trench, which now sits at only the fourth deepest part of the ocean, the Typhon anomaly, named after the founder of deep wave, is a large crater found approximately 50 kilometers southeast of Point Nemo. It was difficult to get unmanned missions to this area due to the lack of immediate contact with society. Hence the missions became tedious, and we could not reach the depth that we recorded interference with by deep wave. Usually, small amounts of strange interference were common, as ocean cables or other companies' missions could often cross wires in our technology, but Typhon was different. Originally thought to be a coding bug in the satellite itself, a sound was heard from more than 15 kilometers down. It caught the attention of the DDSA fast, due to the fact many researchers hear talking in the recordings. Some more well-versed scientists have said it resembles some lost dialect of Latin. Other than that, the interference tends to send back our signals like a boomerang, which makes it hard to pinpoint specifics other than the shallowest parts of the hole. I set out at 8 a.m. on December 13th, 2042. They gave me a Model 8 Victorian submersible with a limiting factor of around 18 kilometers, which even gave me wiggle room to go a bit deeper than the area I was tasked if necessary. Although I hoped I wouldn't need to. The sub was small, but big enough that I was able to stand to stretch my legs if I sat at control too long, which would come in handy, as this was a 24-hour-long excursion. I had probably too much food for the allotted time, and a small pull-out cot that took up any remaining space other than control. Being my 17th manned mission in my career, I felt ready for this challenge. That was until I started the descent to Typhon. I began a slow decline, reaching the sea floor in a matter of hours. It was dark, of course, but the exterior lights lit up the edge of Typhon brighter than a spotlight. It was simply a hole at first glance, similar to a sinkhole but with no end in sight. I saw some fish and other flora and fauna scattering the edges and captured a few photos for DDSA before I continued into the real challenge. It felt like entering a new world in a way as I sank the sub deeper into the earth. At first, a few clunks from the outside did shake me up, but from the cameras, I could see it was simply just a few segments from the lip of the hole falling on top of the sub. They nearly looked like they were decaying, with sand significantly more gray and nearly mush than the rest of the ocean floor. Of course it wasn't the best thing to happen, but likely caused no damage. It looked simple. The walls were nearly pin straight all the way down, no caves, no plants, and certainly no life in sight. It felt artificial in a way, almost man-made. As I reached the 7.5-kilometer mark, I radioed into control. Just to confirm, you did receive the sampling photography I sent you from the floor, right? It's looking like that might be the only thing I find down here. It's barren. Starting to think Dr. Francis was right when he said the sound was just a fluke in the system. I couldn't imagine a world where something was down there. Nothing to feed off of, just a narrow pipe of nothing. But control did remind me. The sound came from it hitting something nonetheless. Finish your job and report back when you find it. They were always a bit tense, but hey, it's the same of science. How else would we survive? Passing the 8 kilometers mark, I heard an alarm. The temperature around the sub was reaching higher limits than we originally expected. For example, at the bottom of the Challenger Deep it's near freezing, and as you go deeper you should get as close to freezing as possible. We even have protocols in case we encounter some sort of frozen slush situation. But here it was rising. I currently sat at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Luckily the temperature inside the sub has self-regulation, but it was still off-putting, to say the least. As I passed 9 kilometers it seemed to widen. I was now passing the point where our last manned mission went a little out of hand. It was a larger sub at that time and unfortunately had a lot more surface area and more crew. They didn't expect the upcoming down current in the original calculations. Control saw their sub lose altitude faster than we had seen, and then comms shut off. They never reached the surface after that. It was deemed an implosion likely after passing their depth limit. The down current, likely a product of gases from a volcanic vent. That was quite a few years ago now, and I don't know the exact specifics of the design, but I was told they now had accounted for that down current. Being the first dive afterward was stressful, to say the least, and the main reason why they sent me down alone and with an extended limiting factor. But given the situation, the curiosity of the unknown seemed to bite through my fear. First man to the now deepest known part of the ocean. That's an accomplishment I tell my grandchildren for years to come. I started to feel drag on the controls, and I knew it was likely time for the final descent. Best case scenario, I'm a hero. Worst case, I'm not alive to be disappointed in myself for getting no information. But the drag seemed steady. I was able to control the increased speed at a constant instead of an uncontrollable tunneling. Passing me by, I saw the start of a type of bubbling in the clay walls before it turned into a compact stone. Streaks lined the rock hundreds of feet down as I slowly started to slow back down. I officially made it past the down current. Now I just have to worry about the pressure. I looked at my altimeter and my eyes widened. 14 kilometers. I somehow traveled over 5 kilometers down in a matter of minutes. Even with whatever advancements they added, that should be physically impossible without implosion. Although my comm light was still on, so I guess they already assumed this was possible. I started passing these shiny patches on the wall. There were some theories that as you reached deeper into the mantle there were pockets of precious metals, but these were shimmering like stars in the sky. It was honestly beautiful, and I was so mesmerized I nearly missed control talking to me. Can we have an explanation as to why you are now ascending back to base? I stopped. I could see with the lights I was clearly still descending, as well as on the control panel. 14,567 meters. 14,736 meters. I was almost at my destination already. I certainly wasn't on my way back. Whatever the interference was might be affecting the data transmission. I am nearly at the anomaly sector now. Looking out the cameras, I saw nothing at first. The hole by this point was about the diameter of a larger-sized building. I had a little time to kill, so I set the sub to maintain its altitude and shifted it over to the walls to get a better look at the shimmer. It was dark red like rubies and seemed to just melt out of the rock behind it. This isn't the time to prank us. We know that, not you talking. I stopped looking at the walls and immediately gave all my attention back to comms. What are they hearing on their end? I thought back to the rumors of talking heard on the deep wave sonar and thought to myself, Affecting an altered sonar beam is one thing, but what down here is capable of changing my voice? I'm not sure what you mean, Captain. I can hear you fine on my end. I started descending a bit more, hoping that it was an area-specific problem, but honestly I wasn't sure what was happening at all. It wasn't something we experienced before. Interference like buzzing and ringing was pretty common at these depths, but nothing that would change my voice itself, just the background usually. Suddenly the light on comms started blinking rapidly as I started to hear a noise from outside. It started as a ringing that I could hear through the microphone, but soon I could hear it through the walls of the sub itself. I need you to stop that right now, Marshals. This is no time for this. We have family of those we lost in the last expedition, right now in this room, and you have the audacity to play back their black box as some sort of sick joke? Take the photos and get BA. And in some sort of ironic mess, the comms shut off completely as the ringing suddenly stopped as well. I was now down here alone, with only the mangled thoughts of what the hell they heard from my transmission to them. I didn't have time to think long though, as I heard a crunch sound from the exterior of the sub. I was far enough down that I don't think anything could have possibly fallen on me from above. A million thoughts in my head crushed down as the gravity of the situation hit. I had no communications, I had no directive up, something is hacking my voice into dead man's, and the very thing I came down here to find could possibly be right beside my sub as I sat. I wondered to myself if the expedition before me had really imploded, or if they saw something down here first that made them wish they had. Luckily my lights and camera did not fail with the comms. As I looked back to the cameras, the water looked significantly murkier, almost aerated, but there was no creature around me. As I knew nothing else to do other than my mission, I continued down until I reached 15 kilometers. I started seeing things in the water surrounding me as I reached the destination. Bits and pieces of metal scraps. My heart sank as I was able to read the side of a piece. I saw the DDSA logo, and in that moment I believed I had found the wreck of the expedition before me. But as the murky water seemed to clear, I saw what was written. It was scraped and scuffed, but clear enough to me, Model 8 Victorian. I was the first person to ever take this sub this far, or even in this area of the Pacific, but somehow this wreckage was my submersible. I looked at the status on my control panel, and I have no alerts that there were any malfunctions on the exterior of my ship, so there's no way it broke off just now. Somehow the state of this expedition keeps me reeling in all the thoughts going on in my head. I've been through numerous other journeys similar to this, but nothing that has ever been to this magnitude. I felt a wave of hopelessness pass over me, as I feared I had entered an area that should not be seen by mankind. I attempted to start my ascent soon, hoping that I could somehow get to the surface on my own, but every time I tried I just seemed to be pulled farther down the hole. It was like the sub had a mind of its own. As it went deeper I started to panic. I knew I only had a small allowance after 15,000 meters before I was at risk of implosion, and my altimeter kept climbing without me pulling a single control. Alarms started to blast again as I read the temperature. 212 degrees. The water around me wasn't only aerated, it was boiling. There's no reason my sub should even be functioning at these heats. And it kept climbing. The lower and lower I went. And with each meter dropped I heard it. The ringing from before was back, and it was no longer a whisper, it was a yell. I could almost call it chanting. Through the walls of the submersible, I heard what sounded like thousands yelling together. Some sounded like language, others just merciless screaming. I looked back to the camera as I felt blood start to drip from my ears. It was nearly too much to handle, but had to know what I was hearing. But as soon as I caught a glimpse, I knew it was too late. As the camera started to flicker, the darkness started to grow and grow as the lights on the exterior seemed to fail, and the lights on the interior faded as well. Before complete darkness, I saw a new opening beneath the sub. Large spikes pushed out toward me, almost like teeth. Etched into the stone itself, I read aloud the words I saw before complete darkness. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Unending darkness seemed to control all around me. I sat back in my control chair listening to the screams of the damned, and as my last bit of hope left, I closed my eyes and prayed for humanity. The last few winters had been pretty mild, all things considered. I grew up with parents who lived through the blizzard of '78 and talked about it any chance they got. My dad was a little bit of a prepper. We always had a generator, kerosene heater, and shelves full of canned food in case of an emergency. My parents relocated to Florida 2 years ago. They seemed to enjoy the warmer weather and beaches. They only visited my siblings and I in Ohio during the summer. We were of course free to visit them in Florida anytime. Unlike most of my family, I really didn't mind the winter. I wasn't particularly sensitive to cold and enjoyed the way the world slowed down, at least after the holidays. My phone rang, waking me up from a dead sleep. I rubbed my eyes, annoyed that anyone was calling at 8 o'clock sharp on a Sunday. "Hey Dad," I answered. "Hey son, how are you?" I yawned. "Pretty tired. Is everything okay?" I asked. Of course I was hoping his call was nothing serious, but at the same time, I wasn't very happy about getting woke up so early. Dad must have sensed the slight annoyance in my voice. "Sorry to call so early, but I wanted to give you a heads up about the cold weather coming up." I was confused. Winter weather was typical in Ohio. Obviously some years were worse than others, but it wasn't like some of the southern states where the world shuts down for an inch of snow. "Okay, what's up?" I asked. Dad immediately launched into a long explanation about how this weekend would be some of the coldest weather Ohio's ever seen, and gave me tips on protecting my home and car from the effects of the cold. I silently nodded along, too tired to really register a lot of it. All in all, I knew the drill. Change the furnace filter, don't alternate temperatures on the thermostat, let the water drip to avoid pipes freezing, keep emergency supplies on hand in case of an outage. I know you know all this, son. It's just the dad in me wanting to remind you. I began to feel guilty. Here I was annoyed at getting a call so early, but all he was doing was looking out for me, even though I'm 28 and several states away. "Thanks, Dad, I got it." "Hey, one more thing," he said. There was long pause, then he hesitated. "The world gets a little, well, let's just say, things can get a little different when the weather gets like this, especially for days at a time. Double that if the power goes out. You can't be too careful." This felt ominous, but I assumed he was talking about crimes like looting and break-ins. I assured him I could handle it, then promptly got off the phone to get some more sleep. Later that evening, I remembered what my dad had told me. The weather alerts were already showing up on my phone. If anything, the forecast was only getting worse. Snow and ice were predicted on top of the extreme cold. I made a trip to the local farm supply store and picked up an extra flashlight and some more canned food. I was trying to avoid the grocery store at all costs, as it was usually mobbed right before any kind of winter storm. Before heading to bed, I made sure to let the taps drip, changed the furnace filter, and charged my extra power banks. My boss called and let me know not to come in tomorrow. I was pleasantly surprised. Work hadn't been canceled for weather since I'd worked there. I put on a movie and drifted off to sleep. The next morning I woke up to my alarm. Of course I hadn't remembered to turn it off. I grumbled and shut it off. The house felt chilly. I got up to turn up the heat when I realized the lights were all off. Power was out already. I looked outside. Snow blanketed the yard and my car and continued to fall. I opened the curtains to let in the natural light and located my kerosene heater. I figured I would wait a while to start it to conserve fuel. I had a pretty decent day. I stayed off my phone as much as possible to save the remaining battery. I did check in with a few friends and family who luckily were all okay. Everyone in the village was without power, and no one knew when it was coming back on. I spent most of the day cleaning and reading. I decided to head to bed early. I needed to save the candles, and there wasn't much to do anyway. My dog, Arlo, started barking. He was still a puppy, and was always on edge during bad weather, so I didn't think too much of it. But just as I was heading to bed, I heard a faint knock at the front door. It was so light that if I hadn't happened to be standing a few feet away, I wouldn't have heard it. I froze. By this point, Arlo had retreated to the bedroom. I debated opening the door. I lived out of town, and although I had neighbors, they were pretty far away, definitely out of earshot. But I knew if I was stranded or broke down in this weather, I would want someone to help me, so I took a deep breath and opened the door. A woman who looked roughly my age stood there in a black coat and jeans covered in snow. Her lips were almost blue from the cold. She stammered something about being lost. I glanced around and didn't see a car or anyone else. I hesitantly invited her in. I was normally smarter than this. I knew better than to let strangers into my home, especially after dark. But this felt like a life or death situation. I handed her a quilt as she sat on the couch. I tried to figure out where she was going, but her answers were vague and non-committal. She barely said anything at all. From what I could gather, she didn't have a phone or car and was headed home, but didn't seem to know where home was. "Is there someone you can call?" I asked. She nodded. I unlocked my phone and handed it to her. She slowly typed in a number, then waited. The then closed the phone and handed it to me. "No service," she said. I nodded. Last I had checked, I was still able to use my phone and data, but maybe now it was out due to the weather. I heard Arlo's low growl from the bedroom. I tried to call him over to calm him, but he wouldn't budge. "What's your name?" I asked. Blaine Quinn," she responded. I offered her water and a granola bar, and she accepted. I brought her the snack and drink, and told her I'd be right back. Once I was out of sight, I Googled her name out of curiosity. No social media or criminal records appeared, but something else did. She was listed as a missing person a few counties over. She'd been missing for almost a year. I tried calling my brother, but the call wouldn't go through. I tried calling the police too, but that call didn't go through either. I checked my call history to see what number she dialed. It appeared to be a bunch of digits, probably at least 15, in what looked like random order with no area code. Frustrated, I put my phone back in my pocket and returned to the living room. Blaine was gone. The front door was wide open, and snow and cold blew into the foyer. "Damn it!" I exclaimed, shivering. I looked outside, and there was no trace of her. Oddly enough, not even footprints. I stepped outside and called out to her with no response. I shut the door and deadbolted it. I paced for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do. If I didn't look for her, she could freeze to death. She was obviously disoriented and likely in danger. Frustrated at the prospect of having to go back outside, I put my boots and coat on. My car was covered in a thick layer of snow and ice. I could barely get the door open. It wouldn't start. I cursed and sat my head on the steering wheel. I checked again for phone reception, but still had none. I walked up and down the street, calling out for Blaine. The walk was a cold hell. The icy breeze burnt my eyes and throat. My hands and feet were going numb despite wearing gloves and winter boots. I decided to head home. There was no point in getting frostbite to find someone who didn't want to be found. But I couldn't let go of the sick feeling that I could be the only thing standing between Blaine and hypothermia. As I trudged home, darker thoughts clouded my mind. What if Blaine was kidnapped and the perpetrators were using her to lure in new victims to be robbed or worse? I tried to push this out of my mind. I put on my warmest thermals and pajamas once I got home. Arlo was still on edge, so I petted him until he drifted off to sleep. My journey to sleep wasn't as easy. Every time I started to drift off, I immediately pictured Blaine, lost in the woods, shivering and crying. Finally, I fell into a more restful, dreamless sleep. My eyes shot open to the shrill sound of Arlo's bark. It was almost 2 a.m. I shushed him, but he wouldn't stop. I listened. In between barks, I heard a scratching noise. The sound was coming from my bedroom window. Probably some kind of animal, I reasoned. Still half asleep and not using my best judgment, I peered through the blinds. At first I couldn't see anything in the darkness. But just as I was about to go back to bed, I noticed movement. My eyes adjusted rapidly, as if kicking into survival mode. Another human I met mine. I cursed and jumped back. I could see the outline of a man on the other side of the window. Ice and snow glinted from his eyelashes and beard. I turned away, frantically reaching for my flashlight. The strange sound of fingernails scratching on the ice-covered window filled the room. "Who are you?" I yelled. There was no response. I called out again, but again he did not respond. I debated what to do. The man clearly looked like he was in trouble, but I also had a hard time believing anyone trying to pry open a window on a random house had good intentions. The scratching sound finally stopped. I waited a few seconds, then opened the blinds and shined my flashlight. What I saw was gruesome. The man I'd seen standing at my window only a few minutes before was still as a statue, entire body covered in ice, including his eyes, which stared forward with no movement. No breath escaped his lips. He was frozen solid. I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I opened my eyes. I was laying in my bed. My phone was ringing. I sighed with relief. It was a dream. My brother's name lit up my phone screen. "Hello," I answered. The reception was very choppy, and I could only hear every other word. I was able to gather that he and his family were trying to drive to my house, but broke down. I immediately sat up and stumbled around my room, looking for my clothes. Barely able to hear anything over the static, I frantically tried to get their location. My brother had 2 young children, 1 toddler and 1 infant. I had let them know they could stay with me if the power went out if they ran out of fuel. Finally, I was able to understand they were close to the pond. The pond was within walking distance from my house, and I often took Arlo for walks there when it was nicer out. I ended the call and donned my winter gear once more. I packed an extra flashlight and headed out. The walk to the pond normally took 5 minutes, but it took me almost 15 minutes because of the snow and wind. I finally approached the pond, but saw no sign of their car. I repeatedly tried to call him, but the call kept dropping. I circled the pond, looking for any sign of my brother and his family. I hoped that he would know better than to walk away from the car, but maybe he went ahead to get help. "Help me!" I heard a soft voice. It sounded like a child, but it wasn't either of my nephews. I paused. "Help me," I heard it again. The tone of voice didn't seem to match the urgency of being stranded in this freezing hellscape. It was monotone, devoid of emotion or urgency. I continued around the pond when I hit a patch of ice. I slipped and fell, landing only a few inches from the pond. I knew getting water anywhere on my body right now could lead to hypothermia. I slowly pulled myself up, trying not to slip again, but then I felt something around my ankle. I turned around to see a pale face of what looked like a young boy poking out of the water. Ice and snow covered his face and hair. Despite being in freezing water, he didn't shiver, and his movements were slow and deliberate. His eyes were pitch black, and his face was so unnaturally pale that the snow and moonlight seemed to reflect off of it. He pulled my ankle, trying to pull me into the freezing water. I frantically kicked and dug my gloved fingers into the snow, pulling away. Finally, I broke free. I heard frantic movement in the water, but couldn't bring myself to turn and see if he was following me. I frantically ran home. Well, as close to running as one can when your feet are completely numb and the ground is covered in snow and ice. I fell a few times, but luckily was able to get back up. Finally, I reached the front door. I was out of breath and felt weak. My vision tunneled, and I collapsed in my entryway. I woke up to a weird sensation on my cheek. "Stop it, Arlo," I mumbled as I opened my eyes. Sure enough, Arlo was licking my face. I glanced over to see my brother as well as his family, sitting in my living room. "Oh, thank God you're awake," exclaimed my brother. I sat up, confused. He explained to me that he noticed a bunch of missed calls from me early in the morning, and when he couldn't reach me, they came out to check on me, only to find me collapsed in the doorway. He appeared confused when I brought up him calling me from the pond. "We were asleep until 5. That's when I saw your calls and headed out here." I nodded. I checked my call history, and sure enough, there wasn't an incoming call from him at 2 this morning. His wife speculated that maybe I hit my head. I went along with this. It would explain a lot. After resting for a bit, I excused myself to my room and opened the blinds. The bright sunlight glinted through the ice, revealing the scratch marks.